At ours, Provincetown Medical Center number 4 in Kansas was buzzing. Ambulance duty. The town celebrated its 50th anniversary over the summer. Houses with carved lace, real snowy winters with frost and snowfall, institutes and universities, and of course hospitals. But this medical center has a bad reputation. It is called a branch of the cemetery for the high mortality rate of patients not only during the epidemic, but also in times of peace from the war with viruses. Why? The question is rhetorical. At the same time, everyone is brought here by ambulance, ordinary decent citizens with residence registration and official place of work, and maimed or frostbitten, drunk, homeless and unconscious drug addicts. Nurses did not like the latter category. And with good reason. These guys are bringing in bums and alcoholics again. Damn it, Kimberly grumbled. Last time I did all the tests on one of them at 2 in the morning, and he decided to sleep overnight. I took his results this morning, sent them to the bin. Can you imagine, Marion? All that work, all that time, all those drugs wasted, and people had to wait. People who came in by ambulance with something serious. I'm the only one in the lab at night. And I'm stretched thin. Yes, I understand, Kimberly Nurse Marion answered her. But you can't just leave them in the street. They're people. To which Kimberly only grimaced. And it was understood that homeless people were not people, but the dregs of society. Marion had dreamed of becoming a doctor since childhood. True, at a very tender age, a veterinarian. The dream did not come from nothing. During the holidays, she lived with her grandparents in a wooden house, so the presence of a variety of pets in the dwelling was commonplace. The house was not far from a small forest, and her grandfather often brought home an injured hedgehog or a trapped fox. He treated the forest guests. Marion helped, and in the spring she watched as they were released into the forest. As Marion grew older, she realized she wanted to help people too. She decided it was better to be a good nurse than a mediocre doctor. She didn't bother going to college. She graduated from medical school with honors and almost immediately went to work in a municipal hospital, although she was called to a private clinic. And she even agreed to the director's offer. But she worked there for exactly 1 week, and the case was like this. One day the lights went off in the medical center just at the moment when the lab technicians were working on the analyses. Some of them were taken by patients with suspected cancer. Of course, everything had to be redone. The undone ones thrown out and apologized to people, and blood, smears, and so on had to be taken again. But at the hospital's expense, of course. What happened next shocked Marion. The lights came back on after 15 minutes. 2 lab assistants had already collected the spoiled test tubes to throw them away. But the head doctor literally burst into the lab. "What are you doing, you stupid fools? You cows are crazy," shouted Mr. Jonathan to the nurses. "We're writing hospital averages on the labs. I'm not going to pay out of my own pocket for rich people who don't have cancer. They have nowhere else to put their money." Marion's eyes widened. "Are you serious? What if there is cancer?" "Who the hell are you anyway? What are you doing in the lab?" "I'm a new nurse, but I'm on my way out. I'll tell the press how you do your tests and how you treat your patients. You'll see that you'll have fewer rich people," the girl blurted out and left the office, slamming the door. "You wretch," she heard in her wake. As a result, for a week's work she was not calculated, explaining that Marion also owed for allegedly broken ampoules with expensive medicine, and let her thank them for giving her a new labor card without a record and letting her go without an article. The girl did get in touch with journalists, but she faced a cold wall. When the media representatives learnt the name of the owner of the clinic, at first she did not understand anything, but then her mother, who worked in advertising, quickly explained everything to her. "Marion, darling, I have to disappoint you," Mrs. Gwynn said. "This man sponsors half of the city's projects from the mayor's office and funds our newspapers every month. That's why no one will publish dirt on him. Our town is small. Everyone wants to eat not only dry bread, but butter and cheese. If not for themselves, then for their children. Do you understand?" "No, Mum, I don't. He's doing terrible things. It's a crime." "I agree. But this should be handled not by young medical school graduates, but by adult operatives and representatives of the prosecutor's office. Don't worry, I'll meet the right people and pass on the information. This clinic will be investigated." "Really? Really? Where are you going now? I can make a deal. No, Mum, you don't have to negotiate. I can do this on my own. I won't get any experience otherwise. I'll go to an ordinary clinic for ordinary people. Why else did I choose to be a doctor? All right. I don't mind, dear. Mrs. Gwen stroked her daughter's head. As a child, they called Marion Curly because of her long curly hair. The girl's large curls were bright brown in color. Combined with a small nose, bow lips, and turquoise-colored eyes, she looked like an angel. However, her mischievous nature and incredible energy rather quickly turned her into an elemental, though not a bringer of misfortune and destruction. With age, Marion, or Mary, as her family began to call her, turned into a beautiful girl with an active life position. The next day, Marion came to the personnel department of the medical unit number 4, and she was immediately sent for an interview with the head nurse. The latter, seeing a red diploma and a sane future employee, was very pleased and immediately sent her for registration. Medical personnel in public hospitals and polyclinics was severely lacking, despite the fact that their city was considered a student center in Kansas with one of the best medical schools in the country, graduates of which magically disappeared. Every year, 250 people disappeared each year, as if they were in a scary house. Marion, experienced doctors with long experience, explained this phenomenon in different ways. For example, with regard to surgeons, the deputy chief physician, Mr. Addison, with whom Marion became friends, and in this hospital she worked for the 2nd year, said the following. You see, Marion, when yesterday's schoolboys first go to medical school, they have little idea of what they will have to face in practice. This is especially true of surgeons. The narrow specialization begins in the 3rd year, and practice only after graduation, when, having got to the state polyclinic and hospital, they see a real situation, not invented. The romantic fog dissipates. Overloaded with patients, the inability to earn decent money without exhausting labor, fighting everyday life, and sometimes the awareness of their own powerlessness. And that's the worst part. Why powerlessness? A doctor is not God, he can't do everything. And that's okay. That's true, but that's not what I'm saying. The system sometimes ruins everything, and you'll realize that soon enough. A few years ago, when you were still just studying, in our city introduced an experimental system, when the money followed the patient. That is, a person came to the hospital, he was treated, and the bill for this care was paid by the insurance company that issued the policy. Each polyclinic has its own agreements with insurers. Since our region was the first, no one had really mastered this innovation yet. The result was the same as always and even worse. People came to their polyclinic, to which they were attached at their place of residence, in order to get, for example, a referral to another medical center for an ultrasound examination of the kidneys or stomach, since their own polyclinic did not have the appropriate equipment. And what did they do? Gave them this referral, offering them help in their own clinic. At the same time, the patient was to be examined not by a specialized specialist who could help treat his disease, but, say, by an ordinary general practitioner. The money, as I have already said, went to the patient. And if everyone scattered to other polyclinics, what would the insurance company and the head doctor of a particular hospital get? As a result, people just died sitting in horrible queues or paid bribes to get this referral. And what all this ended up with was learnt in New York. The inspections began. The then head of regional healthcare was summoned to the carpet. And when he returned home after the rubbish in the capital, he died a few days later of a heart attack. So much for the system. It is clear that those doctors who did not give people referrals to the right specialist in other clinics in order not to lose money did not act independently. And even the head doctor, most likely, was not always involved. Although the management of polyclinics, of course, could not be unaware of this mess, but they could not go against the higher management either. It could, the girl answered very seriously. A person always has a choice. Another question is that something would have to be sacrificed for such an approach. And were these head doctors ready to make such a sacrifice for the sake of people's health or not? Marion, you're being too harsh. They all have children, families to feed, responsibilities to their loved ones. It's one person who can go into seclusion and learn the meaning of life. I don't know, but I prefer the phrase, do what you have to do, and there will be what happens if some doors close, others are bound to open, and then. Maybe it was a test of a higher power. But, Mr. Addison, It's almost like a fairy tale: go left and you lose your horse, go right and you lose your life. But straight is straight. Mr. Addison smiled and poured Marion more coffee. In her second year of work, Marion realized what her senior comrade meant. The marginalized members of society were being brought in and out that day. It had turned sharply colder outside, and the frostbitten men and women, stunned by exhilarating substances, had nowhere to be placed, only to be placed, only to be sat down and not laid down. But it was a man in a dirty jacket and similar jeans that caught Marion's attention. He was half lounging on a sofa in the reception area, throwing back the long dark hair that covered his face. Marion stepped closer and saw that the man was young, no more than 27, and handsome, only somewhat haggard. He opened his eyes and Marion was struck by their incredible blue color. "Help," he whispered with just his lips. "I have diabetes. I need a shot of insulin urgently. I'm in your queue here and I won't live long enough to see a doctor." "Give me your passport. Do you have an insurance policy?" "What's your name?" Marion asked, confused, and took his hand to check his pulse. And immediately noticed that the young man had very well-groomed hands with a manicure, obviously made recently. That's a strange-looking tramp. If he is a tramp, of course, she thought. "My name is Brian, and I don't have any ID. I passed out in the street. My sugar must have dropped. I got really hungry, and then I got dizzy. And that was it. I don't remember how I got here. I had a bag with money, documents, phone, laptop, and insulin with a syringe. I always carry that with me. Wait a minute. I'd like to see your passport in your jacket pocket, please." "Yes, now, but you take it off," asked Marion. She helped the strange young man up and took off his jacket. Brian's reaction was unexpected. "Wait a minute, but that's not my jacket. What are these rags?" He lowered his head and stared at his jeans and tattered trainers. The man wasn't wearing socks at all. "Those things aren't mine either. Look, I've been stripped, it turns out." And to avoid attracting the attention of passers-by who might call the police to a naked man lying on a bench, they put this old stuff on me. So how long was I lying there? He didn't get a chance to finish. The boy began to shake, sweat dripped down his face, and he lost consciousness again. Marion did not bother with the origin of his rags and the identity of the patient, but galloped to the head nurse, Annie. "I need an ampoule of insulin now." Only the patient hadn't been processed yet, tests hadn't been taken, and he had no ID. Annie took off her glasses and stared at the girl. "What do you mean, no paperwork? And the policy, how are we going to take him in? We're not even an ambulance, we can only put him in for money." "We have to report back later," said Annie. "A person with type 1 diabetes needs multiple injections of insulin. And once is not enough, because the increase in blood glucose during the day and the peak of maximum sugar, which reduces the effect of insulin, may not always coincide in time and severity of the effect. Therefore, a lot of it is needed. In this case, most of the drug should be injected necessarily in the morning, and the rest in the evening before dinner. But my dear, only one ampoule costs $50. Suppose now I can pay for this poor man's medicine out of my own pocket. But then what? We'll have to put him down. We can't just throw the patient out on the street. That means it would cost about $6.00 a day, in addition to other procedures and drugs. Where are we going to get that?" "Then Annie might not be here," Marion said. "He'll die if we don't give him an injection now." The head nurse was silent for a moment, then pulled out the keys to the drug stores. "Let's go under my responsibility." 5 minutes later, they were in the basement. Annie went straight to the right rack, took 3 boxes of insulin and some syringes. "Why so many?" Marion asked afterwards. "I'll tell you all about it later. Let's go quickly." They almost ran down the corridor to the waiting room where the strange guy Brian was lying. Marion quickly gave him an injection, and he began to come round. In the meantime, Annie had disappeared somewhere and appeared already dressed. "I called a taxi. I'm taking the lad back to my house. He can't stay here." "Do you live with your parents?" "You're going to have to answer a lot of questions. I've been living alone for a long time. Besides, I'm off duty. I've got my meds for the first few days, and then we'll see." "Annie, you're going to get fired. I'm not afraid of being sacked. I'll get a job. But you're a pensioner. It's hard for you to go out, isn't it? That's right, a pensioner. I have a good pension. Plus my kids send me money every month. They're successful. They manage to stay in the capital. They both live well, earn money. Alex has his own business. All right, Marion, we're off. Help me take your godson to the taxi. He's a tall, big bloke, said Annie. Come and see me after your shift. I've sent you the address. We'll talk about what to do about the drugs we stole. Yes, Annie, of course I will. The tour of duty went relatively smoothly, and there were no further adventures. A thunderstorm broke out the morning after the medication reports were due. By law, not only the written version had to be handed in, but also the used ampoules after injections. Of course, it was impossible to use 3 packs of expensive insulin overnight, unless the entire diabetic ward from some other hospital was suddenly brought to the nursing unit at the same time. For some reason, all the nurses on duty for the past 24 hours were called. Girls, we have a very unpleasant situation, the head doctor Vanessa said, scanning the eyes of her subordinates. We have 3 packs of insulin missing. Doesn't anyone want to tell me anything? Yes, without waiting for the confusion in the team, the air raid and possible search of innocent colleagues' belongings, Marion answered. I took the medication, Vanessa. Don't ask me why or why not. I still won't say. If you're going to make a criminal case, you'll tell me. If you don't, I'll write a letter of resignation. The doctor was silent for a long time. She was an intelligent and experienced woman, a professional doctor and a good manager of this medical center for 10 years. During these years, she had seen a lot of things and different staff members, and she understood that this girl, who had worked for them for less than 2 years, was anything but a thief or a drug addict, capable of committing an official crime for the sake of a dose. Unless it was for someone else? She did it out of love. Going with some idiot hooked on needles, slot machines, or credit, Vanessa pondered, God, what am I going to do with her? She was such a great nurse. I don't know why I called the whole team. So she and I would have solved the issue quietly. And now I'll have to fire her, so that others won't have to. If that's the case, I'll let her go, or worse, I'll leave her to work. Then in a month, I'll be out of stock. What a silly girl. What a shame. All dismissed, said Vanessa, and went to the door of the office, locked it with a key. And you, Marion, stay. The staff, shocked by Marion's crime, who had an impeccable reputation, and by her frank confession, dispersed, discussing the precedent. Marion, sit down. I guess you had very serious circumstances, or you wouldn't have done what you did. But understand me, I have to fire you. And not just fire you, I have to fire you. I understand, Vanessa, I understand, Marion said. What do you realize? That you're 20 years old? You can't get a job with such a record in your employment record. It's a ticket out of here. That we'll be without our best nurse before Christmas, when patients are brought in packs with frostbite, poisoning, severed arms and legs. Why are you giving up on yourself? She understands. All right, Marion, go home. I'll sign the order this afternoon. You'll be paid within 3 days. Marion silently left the office and went to her room to pack her things and go straight to Annie. She remembered again the blue eyes of the night visitor in strange clothes and without documents, and her heart warmed. She hadn't realized yet that she'd fallen in love with this Brian with the royal surname of King. Marion didn't think about the fact that she was out of work. Youth is often careless, and besides, she was not an orphan and did not die of hunger. After all, you can go to the carers, in some private office. There are plenty of them in the city, and they pay quite well, not like in the budget medical center. Vanessa pulled a pack of thin cigarettes from the table and smoked nervously. She suddenly remembered the story of her family and her own unhappy, tragic love. Vanessa was already 100% sure that feelings were involved. She had seen Marion's eyes, in which flashed dreaminess and firefly, and the first signs of heartbreak from the little rascals Cupid and his older brother Cupid. Vanessa was born in New York to a family of hereditary doctors. They immigrated from Russia before the collapse of the USSR. With such a surname because of the fifth point, there were problems time and again. And her grandmother fell under the repressions of '51, becoming a defendant in the doctor's case. Interrogations and bullying began. Young therapist Maggie, Vanessa's grandmother, could not avoid them. She remembered her tormentor warden Matthew Green for the rest of her life. From his ascetic surname, the young sadist had nothing in his appearance or character. Some pathologically perfect beauty was combined with animal cruelty. He came to Maggie every night and forced her to do things that long afterwards in her dreams made her scream and beg for mercy. How she was able to get pregnant after that and give birth to Vanessa's mother is a mystery. In March 1953, the case of the doctors ended automatically. All the accused were acquitted. But how can one forget those terrible 2 years? Maggie remembered them for the rest of her long life. They say that we have all lived once before, and those who torment us in this life suffered from us in the past. God knows if that's true or not, but the Matthew Green family became a real curse on the family. In time, Maggie came to her senses, married and had a daughter, Monica, in 1958, and Monica in 1982. Vanessa, or Radu as she was called at home. Immediately after high school, she went to medical school, med school. And in 2008, she fell in love. A young man named Sebastian was well-built, educated, a native New Yorker from a wealthy family. Graduated from law school. He liked Vanessa too. They dated for a year before they decided to introduce their families and announce their upcoming wedding. Rada was 2 months pregnant. A cafe was bought and relatives were invited. Maggie's mom, dad, and grandma came first. Everyone was looking forward to the celebration. And then the groom's family came in. Everyone sat down at the table, and suddenly Vanessa and her parents heard some kind of eerie sigh. They turned to Maggie and saw that she was pale as a sheet, wheezing and sliding off the chair. Vanessa rushed to her aid, but when she turned to Sebastian to tell him to call an ambulance, she saw another strange thing: a very elderly but still handsome man. Smiling crookedly, pale as chalk, he was almost jogging out of the hall. Behind him, there was no time for that. They waited for the doctors and left with their grandmother for the hospital. Maggie regained consciousness the next day. A stroke had been ruled out. She opened her eyes and saw Vanessa sitting next to her. "Vanessa, baby, what's your fiancé's last name?" "I never asked you," she asked hoarsely. "There was no need, Grandma. Sebastian has a rare surname, an unusual Green. Which means I'm not wrong, unfortunately." "Vanessa, you can't marry him," Granny said. "Why not?" "Because I'm 2 months pregnant. I'm not getting rid of a baby, and I'm not getting rid of my firstborn." "What are you talking about? You're a doctor." "I don't understand you at all." "I can't tell you everything yet, baby. You go home and tell Monica to come to me." "Yes, Grandma. Of course, Mummy was with you all night. I changed her this morning. She's asleep and she'll come." Maggie closed her eyes. Despite her 87 years of age and the trials of her youth, she had a sober mind, strong nerves, and good health. Genetics had never been canceled, but for the first time in her life she didn't know what to do, how to tell Vanessa about all this. It wasn't her and Sebastian's fault, but it was genetics. And Maggie was sure that the grandfather of her granddaughter's fiancé was mentally unhealthy, a sadist, a real maniac. What if Vanessa has a boy who inherits his grandfather's proclivity? After all, abnormalities, like genius, are often passed down through generations. And then, how will she be able to communicate with the family of the man who tried to hurt and abuse her? With unanswered questions, Maggie fell asleep by morning. The decision had matured. She decided to tell her daughter and granddaughter everything. After all, Vanessa had to know what kind of family she was about to enter. But man presumes and God disposes. In the morning, Vanessa arrived at her grandmother's house at noon. She was extremely excited. "Grandmother, hello. Well, we'll never get married to Sebastian," she said. "Can you believe it? His grandfather, Matthew Green, hanged himself. That's almost 90 years old. He was a decorated policeman and all that. I still can't believe it. He hanged himself." Maggie couldn't believe her ears. "Did he leave a note?" she asked. "He did, but it wasn't very interesting. Just, 'I'm sorry for everything.'" "I see," Maggie said, though she didn't really understand why Matthew Green, a sadistic criminal, had suddenly decided to take his own life in his old age. Was he afraid of something? Even if she dared to tell Sebastian, or worse, the journalists, no one would believe her. They would have thought that the grandmother was crazy in her 87 years. or decided to make money on the sensation, to embarrass a wealthy man in today's time, and honored artists are not bent on creating fake sensations for the sake of hype or money. So this option would not surprise anyone. Another question is that if she, Maggie, has not told anyone anything until today, what is the point of doing it before the wedding of her granddaughter? And yet the elder Green was so scared of something that leaving his life was the only possible way out for him. God works in mysterious ways. Soon Monica arrived. She began to torture her mother about what she was going to tell her, but she decided to keep silent for the time being. As time went on, she did the right thing. A week later, Vanessa slipped near the house, fell and hit her back hard. The baby wasn't saved. Perhaps there was some kind of divine providence in it. A month later, Sebastian married another girl. His father had a big business in the US. She lost her head for the guy. The one reflected that by marrying, albeit an ugly but very rich girl with solid accounts in foreign banks, he would have everything much faster than with his labors in his homeland. Love? Well, love, he thought. What was it that King Solomon used to say? All things pass, and this too shall pass. And by maturity it won't be very important at all. Much scarier to stay at 40 years old with empty hands, with a one-room flat inherited or unpaid mortgage, and a belly from poor diet and inability to attend a good gym with his wife. Here it will not be to love. The hemorrhoids would be cured at public expense. 40 days after the death of his beloved grandfather, they quietly signed with his new bride and flew to San Francisco. Vanessa terribly experienced first the loss of a child, then the betrayal of her fiancé. She abandoned the institute, almost stopped eating, and lay with her face to the wall, listening to some depressive rock from morning till night. That's when Maggie told her. All that Vanessa heard, strangely enough, it brought the girl to her senses. She got drunk for the first time in her life then, and then somehow she calmed down dramatically, finished med school. Found an ad for an open position as a doctor in the state of Kansas in a county, and went to the state's county. As she told her family, to give herself back to herself, but she didn't want to come to New York and start over from scratch. Neither did she want to get into a personal relationship, although she was a very attractive woman and always had men hanging around her. Recently she turned 35 years old, the prime of beauty and feminine strength. Vanessa smoked a cigarette and began to draw up an order for Marion's dismissal. Suddenly her mobile phone rang, and the number of the head of the regional health department popped up. Vanessa was surprised and somewhat tense, although she didn't remember any offenses. She picked up the phone. "Vanessa," "Hello," said a familiar voice. "Good morning, Mr. Terrence. What's wrong?" "What's wrong?" "The mayor and his mate, millionaire Oliver King, are coming to see you now. You know him. He owns factories, newspapers, steamships." "I know him. But why? God forgive me. They want to give money to the clinic. We can't do that. You know we're on national projects. And you can't even take gifts on a birthday. You'll be accused of corruption. For 3 old roses and a bottle of cognac." "Calm down. Oliver King has a son who's diabetic, insulin dependent. He collapsed on a bench yesterday afternoon, passed out in the center of town. Unfortunately, it all happened behind the university. There's not many passers-by there, and the students were in the middle of their classes. So some scoundrels stripped him, dressed him in their rags, and stole his bag with all his documents, gadgets, money, and insulin. Luckily, a couple in love were passing by. They called an ambulance. The guy's been brought to you. He should be at your place." On some subconscious level, Vanessa began to form a picture: 3 boxes of insulin missing from storage, Marion refusing to say why she'd stolen them. Wait. They don't have a patient called King, Vanessa thought. She was personally checking the incoming patients. She couldn't sleep that night, and there was nothing to do at home alone, so she stayed the night in her office. And then everything fell into place. Vanessa had learnt well over the year the character of her nurse Marion and her commitment to the exploits in defense of all the outcasts. And if the guy is also good-looking, it makes sense. But why does she need 3 boxes of insulin? And where is this millionaire's son? By the way, what's his name? Vanessa asked. Brian King, born in 1986, Mr. Terrence replied, blood type 2, Rh positive. Tall, well-built brunette. Looked like a real bum, though. No ID, no money. They brought him in like that. Yeah, well, at least yours didn't kill him. They could have just thrown him in the ward, taking him for a drug addict, if he was unconscious and hallucinating. What are you saying? Vanessa said quietly. I'll call you back in exactly 10 minutes and don't be nervous. I'm pretty sure everything's fine. And Brian King is fine. Vanessa had already put 2 and 2 together and realized that her staff really wouldn't have helped a patient like Brian King. But not because they were indifferent, but because of the wild workload of yesterday's ambulance and the inability to label Brian's own problem if he was nearly unconscious. Apparently Marion had somehow managed to talk to him and, without waiting for permission from her superiors, had administered the insulin, realizing that time was running out in minutes and the guy would just die. But where did she take him? No way. I didn't realize. It's not without our Annie. Vanessa slapped herself on the forehead. And the 3 boxes? They took them because they didn't know how long it would take them to find the relatives of the rescued young man. Vanessa dialed the head nurse's mobile phone. Yes, came Annie's cheerful voice. I'll be right back. Bring your guest to us. I'll send a car right away. His parents have been found, Dad. In particular, it's the millionaire Oliver King. They're on their way over for the stolen insulin, don't worry. And Marion, too. Just bring the rest of the ampoules. Okay, there was a pause, then a short exhalation, and finally we're sending him out. I just fed him. But how did you guess that the regional health center helped? And I'm not weak-minded myself, Vanessa grinned. Well, see you later and call Marion. Tell her to come back, smiled the head doctor and exhaled. She was very glad that she would not have to change her opinion about Marion and fire one of the best employees. Half an hour later, Annie and Marion brought Brian to the hospital, and half an hour later some important guests arrived. Brian looked, delighting everyone. He was able to shower at Annie's, eat, sleep, and get the right dose of his life-saving insulin. A tall man in his mid-50s walked into the doctor's office with quick strides, very similar to the overnight guest, Annie. He was also tall, handsome, and well-groomed. Hi, Dad, Brian exclaimed. I'm sorry, I don't know how I passed out in the street. I got the injections just in time. What are you apologizing for, you what? Dad asked. Go on, get in the car and I'll talk to your saviors. Wait, Brian said. Come on, let's go out into the corridor. And the 2 kings walked out of the office. Dad said, Brian, when they were alone, I'd like you to invite this girl Marion to our house as a family nurse and my personal assistant. She's savvy and not afraid to take charge in critical situations. She should be a military doctor, and I think she can handle our grandmother. I made sure of that tonight. By the way, did you find the people who robbed me? We found them, and we traced them to the ambulance that took you away. They went to your laptop to turn it in, and there's a mountain of photos of us inside. The owner of the tech pawn shop private messaged me on Telegram. Lucky for me, I was online. Usually first the thing is taken to the pawn shop, then for 2 or 3 hours the seller waits for it. You don't know if it doesn't work or if it's worthless, and only then the money is given out if everything is in order. So when those bastards showed up for their fee, my guards were waiting for them. They showed me where they found you, but you were gone. So I called the ambulance and found out who was on duty the night before. Thank God I didn't have to search my brains, Oliver King said and turned away from the window. Dad, it's all right. Brian, Marion, you say? He smiled and looked at his son carefully. Is it the one with the curly hair, green eyes, and long eyelashes, or the one who is a pensioner with the face of a good sorceress? Oh, Daddy, exclaimed Brian. All right. The girl's really good and pretty. But will she want to come to us because she's proud, or am I not good at people? And will they let her leave the hospital? You talk to the head doctor. Let's give her money for something useful. Or give the nursing unit something. And we need to make a clever offer to Marion, so she won't be offended, won't think we're buying. And most importantly, she wouldn't say no. Oh, Brian, you're not in love, are you? Oliver grinned. Well, to be honest, almost Brian replied. Dad, will you help me? Get in the car. You're a lifesaver, Oliver said. Of course I will. And the elder king headed back to Vanessa's office. Interestingly, it should be noted, he liked the head doctor, which didn't happen often. It had been 7 years since his wife Sharon had died, but Oliver hadn't met a woman he wanted to date, let alone marry. And then he was pushed. He and Sherry, as friends and family called her, had met when they were both in their early 20s, almost as old as Marion and Brian were now. It was the 80s, with all that entailed. The country was getting ready for a dramatic change. They weren't visible yet, but revolutionary moods were already in the air. But the guys were young, good-looking, in love with each other and with life. Despite everything, Oliver studied at medical school to become a pediatric surgeon, but even then he realized that supplying medical equipment and drugs was the future. He opened his first company's technical and commercial pharmacies, brought for sale lasers, humidifiers, tonometers, and so on. Oliver King began to unwind. They got married. Brian was born. Incredibly, Oliver managed to avoid conflicts with gangsters who obsessively offered their patronage. He didn't pay tribute, like most businessmen of the time in general. The fact is that before going into business, he saved the life of a young son of one of the criminal authorities. And it happened so distribution after institutes has already been abolished, but in medical institutes senior students were obliged to pass practice in medical centers of the city. Oliver got to the Children's Regional Hospital. He was brought kids from the village, and often in a neglected state. At night he was on duty. At 12 o'clock the doors of the hospital opened, and a young man literally ran in with a 3-year-old boy in his arms. The child was wheezing, gasping for breath. A dangerous blue color had already appeared around his lips. 2 tall, stout men and a young woman ran after the man. Having flown past the guards, the group rushed to the first floor, where the resident's room and the chief physician's office were located. The latter had been gone for a long time. Mr. Davies had not only delayed the salaries of his staff, but some nurses with small children had to walk across town to work with the lights off. At the same time, the head doctor was skiing in Shirigesh, practically not appearing at his workplace. Oliver was alone in the resident's room at that hour. The door opened and a man with a child came in. "Hello. Where are your pediatricians, surgeons? Is there a doctor in charge? Help my son. He's been breathing like this for 4 hours. The ambulance, bitches, has not arrived." "I'm a surgeon," Oliver replied. He washed his hands, changed his clothes, dialed an intercom line for assistance and a nurse. He was almost certain that the child had croup and needed to be operated on immediately. Only the cause needed to be clarified. Was it a foreign body in the throat or a complication from the flu? He went to the examination room and examined the boy and realized that time was running out. If not by minutes, then not more than a couple of hours. "Prepare the operating theater immediately," he commanded. "Doctor, save my son," begged the boy's father, wiping the cold sweat from his face. "I won't be in your debt." "Young man, we'll do everything we can and more," Oliver King replied. "And you need to calm down and pull yourself together." "Are you the mother?" He turned to a frail woman with huge, tear-filled eyes. "Yes, pray. A mother's prayer will reach from the bottom of the sea and save. Pray to the Virgin Mary." "Are you a Christian, baptized?" "Yes." "Everything will be fine," he said and left. The operation was indeed successful, and eventually Oliver extracted a small button from the baby's throat, which was the cause of the choking. The boy was moved to a separate room and the mother was allowed to stay with him and nurse her son. Oliver King. He heard behind him and turned round. The child's father was standing there. "Do you smoke?" "I do." "Let's go to the residence lounge." Oliver King. "The first OU for life. My name is Walter Peruncival, in criminal circles, Perun. I'm not offering you money. I know you won't take it. But I can protect you and your family from my colleagues, so to speak, should you ever have the need." "I understand. Thank you, Walter. I hope I don't have to call on those kind of services. But what the hell, we live in America. You better watch your son. A couple more hours without medical attention, that's it." He must have nicked that button somewhere and put it in his mouth. 3 years later, Oliver really had to turn to Walter for help as he started his own business. And if it hadn't been for Walter, nothing would probably have worked out for Oliver. Because fighting alone with numerous criminal gangs, raising a son, supporting a family and simultaneously doing business was simply unrealistic. It took 20 years, and Walter became Walter Perruncivil, the mayor of their small provincial town, and Oliver King a millionaire, owning several businesses. Walter's son John had grown up, served in the army, though his father had offered him civilian options, and now worked alongside his parents, taking the position of deputy mayor for security. Over the years, the men had become friends and experienced a variety of situations. Oliver King hadn't practiced as a doctor for a long time, having fully immersed himself in business. True, his own son Brian was diagnosed with insulin-dependent diabetes at age 17. That was the year Sharon passed away. A blood clot broke. She didn't even feel a thing. The loss of a mother to her son was the trigger for the development of the disease. Sharon was the only daughter of her mother Elizabeth. She raised her alone. After her death, the woman had to undergo several sessions with a psychologist. Oliver took his mother-in-law in. That's how the three of them lived for the last 7 years. Oliver King looked into Vanessa's office. The women were drinking coffee. They were entertained by Oliver's security guard Jasper, the soul of the company and a charming favorite of the fair sex. Despite the fact that he was in his 6th decade, Jasper was in great physical shape. Jasper told them stories and anecdotes, and the ladies rolled with laughter. When he saw the chief, Jasper immediately turned serious, and with a nod to his partner, left the office. "All right," Oliver said, not going inside yet, and began to give instructions. "Jasper, go get flowers for the ladies according to their tastes. I'll tell them what bouquets to buy for the evening. Book a table at the restaurant. That's all for now. Lovely women, let me thank you for your son and invite you tonight to the best restaurant in our city to celebrate the fact that everything has come to a good end." "Are we really going to a restaurant?" Annie asked, smiling flirtatiously, glancing at Vanessa. "Yes," Oliver said. She was staring at her computer, pretending to be incredibly busy. In fact, for the umpteenth time that morning, she found herself thinking that she liked this Oliver King. For the first time in years. And it wasn't surprising he was tall, dark-haired, and very good-looking, reminding her of a young Viggo Mortensen. By the way, fun fact, his mother named him so because of his love for the actor in 1967, when the film starring Viggo Mortensen was released. It was watched by 40 million people. And what happened after the premiere with women in the US? Everyone dreamed of finding a life partner, at least a little like Mortensen, played by Viggo Mortensen. Of course, and Edward Norton was very good himself, but still a little lost in this film, Viggo Mortensen. And what was his enchanting voice worth? "We'll be there. Goodbye, girls." Vanessa finally lifted her head from the screen and looked her black eyes straight into Oliver's eyes. "What time is the gathering?" she asked. 7 o'clock, Oliver King replied, keeping his son's blue gaze fixed on her. Marion watched silently, nodding, listening attentively to her superiors and to the father of the young man she had rescued. "Is Brian coming?" "You're not enough for the three of us?" she asked with a serious look. "Certainly," said the elder King in her tone of voice. "We'll invite Jasper too. He's a real charmer, in spite of his age." "How old is he?" Annie, the young pensioner, was now interested. "How old? How old?" All the people in the room asked in unison. "He is a sportsman, a retired officer, a military doctor. He's fought in almost every hot spot. He also sings, waltzes, and embroiders." Oliver looked meaningfully at Annie, and Annie gawked. The women scattered to the shops and hairdressers. The men went home. Vanessa gave instructions to the staff and for the first time in many years went to tidy up. The restaurant Marseille opened in the early 90s and all these years held the brand of the best place in the city. If we talk about the city in France, in honor of which the owner of the restaurant named it, it is the most ancient and multinational city of France, where French, Italians, Spaniards, Arabs, and Corsicans live. That's why the cuisine here is the most diverse. Almost everyone came, only Vanessa was missing. She was late. Suddenly, the male half of the room sighed. Participants of the party raised their heads and also aghast. An absolutely incredible woman had entered the hall, and it was Vanessa. She was wearing a floor-length dress in the color of dark red wine, encircling a luxurious figure, a garnet necklace and the same earrings. and her black as tar hair was arranged in a high hairstyle. She approached the table and smiled. Oliver was speechless. The evening had gone beautifully. Everyone had found a date. Jasper was flirting with Annie, Brian was chatting with Marion, Oliver and Vanessa were nothing to speak of. Finally, the Elder King chose the moment to make Marion an offer she couldn't refuse. "Marion, we have a proposition for you," he said. "Brian and our grandmother need a personal nurse who can always help. Would you be willing to work for us and live on our property? We have a big, comfortable house in the country, a garden, a swimming pool." "You'll be happy with the salary," Oliver added abruptly. "I don't know." Marion answered confusedly and looked at Vanessa. "Go for it," she nodded. "If you want, you can take a month's leave. If everything goes well, you can quit later or come back." Vanessa smiled. And thus began Marion's new life. Of course, she informed her parents. The only thing she didn't tell them was that she was having an affair with Brian, so that, as they say, they wouldn't get excited. She liked the house. There was no flashy luxury, as in many rich homes. Everything made sense and was intended for the comfort of its inhabitants, not for image. She had quickly hit it off with Oliver's mother-in-law and Brian's maternal grandmother, Mrs. Beatrice. Despite her advanced age, she asked to be called just Beatrice. "It makes me feel younger," she explained. It was not for nothing that Lucille Ball asked to be called Lucy. She was a bitch, but she was smart. How am I any worse than Lucille Ball? "I can sing a song or two, by the way," Grandma said cheerfully. She told Marion endless stories from her youth, and she listened without interrupting. Then one day she suggested that Beatrice record them all on a tape recorder so that she could write a book. Beatrice was very happy, and they got on with it. With Brian, the romance developed rapidly. Of course, they tried not to advertise the relationship, although Brian's father did not object to it. On this day, Marion got up very early. She had a lot of errands and trips around the city planned. She didn't take a driver, but set off on foot. She wanted to go for a walk. Winter had just begun, and this year it was warm. Fluffy, almost Christmas-like snow fell from the sky. "Young lady, can I talk to you for a moment?" Suddenly the car door opened next to her, and a young smiling man of pleasant appearance stepped out of it. "Can you help me? I'm not from around here. I can't find my brother's house." And the navigator's broken. As it happens. "Yes, of course. What's the address?" Marion asked. 15 Lenox Street. "That's very near. Are you opposite this house?" Marion exclaimed and fainted, feeling a smell and a rag near her face. She woke up in a wooden house with her hands and feet bound. Opposite her on a stool sat the same young man, only he was no longer smiling. He looked at her silently and smoked. "Are you awake?" "That's fine," he said. "Hi, don't interrupt me. I'll explain everything. I'm going to call your Brian and let him know I have you. He needs to bring me $2 million and I'll let you go." "Why not euros?" Marion wondered. "Why $2 million? No more and no less. It's enough to operate on my child. And if it is not done in the next fortnight, my daughter will die. That's it." Marion was dumbfounded. Then she said, "What's your name? Tell me everything. I'll help you find the money or the opportunity to do the operation. Untie me, yelling and running away, I will not run away. Also, if you extort money from the kings, you'll lose. They've got their own security detail and the mayor's a friend. And the mayor's a former 90s big shot. If you've lived in the city long enough, you know that. It's a no-brainer. How did you come up with this? And why me?" "I'm nobody to them," Marion wondered. "I didn't really think of it," said Jasper, reassuring Marion. "My name is Jasper. And as for the idea of kidnapping, I didn't have time for that. Why you and not Brian? He has an insulin-dependent form of diabetes. I'm aware of that. How would I take him hostage? My daughter's dying. I'm not a scumbag." Marion sat down. "Okay, I'll put the coffee on." "I've been here a long time," she said, and looked at her watch. "I need to make a phone call. I'll be missed soon. Where's my stuff?" "The bag." Jasper handed Marion her purse. She took out her phone and dialed a number. "Beatrice, hi. I ran into an old mate of mine by chance. She's been living in Italy for a long time, married to a local, and came to visit her parents for a week. We haven't seen each other for ages. We'll sit in a cafe for a while, chat, so you don't lose me. I'll be back tonight. I've given Brian his injection, and in the morning I've prepared some porridge with berries and pancakes and cottage cheese for him in the kitchen under a napkin. And you'll eat too, baby, don't worry, replied Brian's grandmother in the voice of Fana Renevskaya. Don't worry, Marion mocked. She, by the way, both her manner and her favorite jokes were from Fana's piggy bank. This isn't a room, it's a well. I feel like a bucket that has been lowered down there, she quoted Oliver King when he solemnly opened the doors of her new office. Yes, Brian's grandmother had her own study. Beatrice wrote memoirs, short stories, and fairy tales for adults. She also smoked a pipe, almost like a famous actor's grandmother, and swore. As for drinks, she respected only high-quality moonshine, which she herself brewed in the huge kitchen of the Kings. Oliver treated her hobby calmly. Firstly, he was quite sure in moonshine, and secondly, he liked to have a drink or two himself. His business had already been established and built. He only controlled the process, having recruited the management of departments from his trusted circle, with whom he had gone through fire, water, and the most difficult situations. That is for glory. At the same time, Beatrice had an aristocratic appearance, tall, still very slender, with a mop of thick hair, which she always dyed in platinum color. Correct facial features, and a thin nose with a hunchback. But what had won the heart of former Lieutenant Colonel Jasper? Annie, in his spare time from guarding Oliver King, Jasper invited to theaters and cafes, and once she said that she wanted to visit a nightclub. Annie, you wouldn't like it there, I'm sure, Jasper said. Why not? Because an intelligent woman with a high intellect, education, a great sense of humor, and good taste can't like it. If all of those things were true, I'd call you Daddy, Annie retorted. But anyway, tonight we're going to that den of debauchery. At least at 60, I should be able to commit a sin, shouldn't I? And off they went. The night bar Tamerlan met them with creativity, illumination, and smoke. The guards at the entrance looked at the atypical visitors with surprise. Alcohol, drugs, and other prohibited substances are not allowed. But I think you know, said one of them. Oh, young man, I brought it by accident. I didn't know, Annie said, and pulled a huge piece of lard out of her purse. The boys stared at first and then laughed out loud. Jasper laughed too, who was used to his friend's antics, but he hadn't expected this. But seriously, guys, this is a treat from me. I suppose you're tired of standing here till morning. Take it. She handed the lard to the guards. They smiled, subdued by the unusual gesture. They thanked Annie and took the gift. If they offend, you tell us at once, they said. Colleagues, no offense will be taken. We'll manage on our own, Jasper retorted. You're in security too? Yes, I shouldn't have realized. You're either military or security, said one of the guys. I'm both, said Jasper. Come on, let's go. They were met by the Ramstein. It was stuffy, and there was no way to talk because of the infernal volume of the music. After 15 minutes, they had already gone to the bar, where it was quiet and hardly any tunes could be heard. Annie, are we going out again tomorrow? Jasper asked cheerfully after they had been sitting at the bar for a couple of hours. Fantastic, she said. Although, perhaps, next time on the performance of songs of the band Kiss will be the best. Robert Johnson raised his daughter Linda alone. With her mother Rachel, he met not in the theater, not in the library, or even on the street. He booked her services. Rachel was pursuing a career as a call girl when they met in the course of her professional duties. The young people suddenly got to talking. And the girl did not complain about life, did not tell sad stories about an alcoholic mother or a mean fiancé. No, she honestly said that she liked this way of life, liked the money she received and the freedom of choice. And she was getting a very good deal. They started dating. And 6 months later, Rachel got pregnant. She decided to keep the baby because she was already 27, and with her lifestyle, she was unlikely to get another chance. She had no doubt that Robert was the father of the child she had had unprotected intercourse with him just 6 months ago. They had had too much to drink. The girl was in good standing in her office, and she was given maternity leave. but Rachel died in labor from blood loss. Something went wrong, and the surgeons couldn't stop the bleeding. To take the girl from the maternity hospital, Robert helped Rachel's colleagues. It is no secret that in criminal structures a lot of useful acquaintances and connections, especially in the business of providing intimate services. Many high-ranking people used them. The daughter was temporarily taken by Robert's parents, and he went to Alaska. He earned well and almost all the money he sent to his parents, leaving himself only to pay for housing, food, and clothes. Getting married somehow didn't work out. He did not go to nightclubs. At work he was very tired and got used to non-private, non-committal relationships. When Linda was 2 years old, he returned from a shift and got a good job in the city. The girl grew up a quiet, sunny child. When she went to school, she studied well, got along with both teachers and classmates. But when she was 15 years old, there was a misfortune. Linda fainted right at the lesson of Russian language. Teachers thought that the girl just overexcited or tired, but of course they called an ambulance. Linda stayed in the hospital for a while. After her tests, the doctors gave a terrible verdict: blood cancer. The first reaction to the news was not even shock, but rage. Robert's parents and he himself decided that the doctors had made a mistake, mixed up the analyses. It could not be that a young girl who had not yet entered into life turned out to have such a disease. Why? She was barely born when she lost her mother. She hardly saw her father because he was always busy earning a living. She didn't even have time to fall in love. Unfortunately, the diagnosis was confirmed, and at the dispensary where they were sent, all hell broke loose. Chemotherapy, mountains of drugs, endless hospital walls. In the end, the attending doctor said that Linda needed an emergency bone marrow transplant. Robert was a suitable donor, but there was no quota for the operation in the near future, and they couldn't wait. And then the man decided to take this wild step to kidnap a man from a rich family and demand a ransom for him. He spent a long time monitoring information about wealthy citizens, their children and relatives. The paparazzi spotted the King family in the restaurant Marseille when Oliver and the women were there. They also got wind of Marion and Brian's affair and colorfully described it. It went viral. That's how Robert knew he had to kidnap Marion. Firstly, the girl was a doctor, and therefore had strong nerves and logic, and secondly, was not a child, which greatly relieved the conscience of the kidnapper. He was not going to harm his hostage, let alone kill her. "Yes, the situation is not easy," said Marion, having listened to Robert's story. "Where is Linda now?" "In the dispensary, though she is hardly treated, just to keep her alive." "Where do you plan to do the operation?" "If the money is available, in Moscow." "Come on, let's go." "Where to?" "To the King's." "Where else?" "Didn't you say you were going to ask them for my ransom?" "You'll get it now." "But I'm still." "You must still." "Are you uncomfortable? 4 hours ago, you were willing to go to jail to get money, and you were right in your own way. Now he's uncomfortable. You don't have a choice. Besides, I'm the one who's going to do the talking and ask for the money." "Yeah, you're right, of course." On their way to town, a real spectacle was playing out in front of the No. 4 medical center. The sick were stuck to the windows, and the staff who had a spare moment were pouring out into the street. A real gypsy ensemble with guitars, violins, and of course soloists had set up under the windows. They sang romances and danced. Then a man in a suit with a huge bouquet of flowers came out of a real horse-drawn carriage and headed towards the hospital. Oliver King SR, and that was him, was on his way to propose. And over the past 3 months, he'd finally made up his mind that Vanessa was the woman he'd been looking for all his life. He walked into her office, and Vanessa was standing at the window watching a gypsy corps de ballet. "Vanessa, darling," Oliver called out. Vanessa turned round and their eyes met. "Will you marry me?" Oliver bent down on one knee and handed her the bouquet. Vanessa's eyes shone mysteriously and happily. "Yes," she exhaled. Oliver stood up, took out a box with a ring, and put it on Vanessa's finger. He was just leaning in for a kiss when his mobile phone rang. Brian popped up on the screen, and Oliver couldn't help but answer it. "Yeah, Brian." "Dad, there's a situation. Anyway, I need you to come home as soon as you can. I need your help. Is something wrong? Something's wrong, but it's not me. You've got to come home. You can't tell me over the phone. All right, Vanessa, there's something going on at home. I have to go. Are you coming with me? I'm coming with you. Is the gypsy Tabor coming with us? No, the Tabor is going to their own Tabor. I'll pay them back. You get ready. In the meantime, Beatrice fed Robert at their house and listened attentively to his story. An hour later, Oliver and Vanessa arrived. Marion and Brian came out to meet them. Dad, here's the thing. I don't know how you feel about it, but people need to be helped. You can do it. I know Robert's only daughter is dying. He needs money for an operation or free quotas. It's a matter of days. And Brian told the young man's story. Oliver listened to his son and remembered how he had almost lost him 3 months ago. What had not changed his mind during that terrible night when Brian did not call back and then became unavailable. Of course, son will help. I'll get Walter on the phone, see if he can work out a quota. If not, we'll send Robert and his daughter to Moscow. We'll wire the money for the operation right away. It's not a problem at all. The main thing is that this operation will help. By the way, I've seen him somewhere before, but I can't remember where. Where have you seen him, Oliver? Jasper just appeared out of nowhere behind him. That's my lieutenant. We came back from Syria together once, came to apply for a job with you. But Robert changed his mind and went to Alaska to work. He thought it would pay better. How? You fought together? Then all the more reason to help. So he dialed the number of the mayor and former criminal mastermind, Walter. Walter, hi. Here's the deal. I need to help a good man, Oliver said. When can he and I meet you tomorrow? Great. I'll see you tomorrow. Robert was in the kitchen when Jasper walked in. When he saw him, he put his mug on the table and started to get up. Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, it can't be. Yes, it can. Well, hello, Lieutenant Robert Johnson. Robert was left overnight in the house, and they spent the whole night talking with Jasper over a bottle of brandy, remembering the living and remembering the dead. In the morning, they went with Oliver to the town hall to see Walter. He listened attentively and started making calls in front of them. Guys, are there really any quotas available? Not at the moment. But I'll help with the money. No, Alex, I'll give you the money. You're under a microscope right now. There's a fight against corruption, so the guilty and the right are both being brought to justice. 3 days later, Robert and his daughter flew to New York. They were already waiting for them there. The operation was a success. Linda had a good chance of permanent remission. She was already smiling, a blush appeared on her cheeks, and her appetite had returned. Robert stayed with his daughter, telling her stories, and later the doctors allowed her to watch films and use the computer. Oliver subsidized Robert not by $2 million, but more. It was only fair to point out that in New York you had to live on something, eat something, and there were few unforeseen expenses. In 2 months they were promised to be discharged. In the meantime, the Kings were preparing to marry 2 people at once. Brian proposed to Marion, and she, of course, accepted. But before that, the occupants of the mansion had to endure another event. On Saturday morning, waking up, Oliver decided to go out into the yard to brush the snow, to breathe the frosty fresh air. He stretched, straightened his shoulders, and suddenly there was some sort of growl or roar behind him. When he turned round, he almost turned gray. The gate was open, and behind it stood a small-sized lynx. The wild cat and Oliver looked at each other in silence. Then the spotted guest entered the courtyard and yawned with all his formidable maw. There was no escape, and Oliver didn't know what to do. The only consolation was the fact that it was clearly not an adult cat, but a teenager. After 5 minutes, fortunately, the situation resolved itself. Following the teenage lynx, a skinny girl with a leash literally flew into the yard. Mars ran away. "And where's that sneaky bastard?" she exclaimed. Curious. "May. Don't worry, he won't hurt you. We came from the circus and stopped at a shop to buy some water. And Mars was in the car. He must have opened the door with his paw and got out. But how did he open the gate? The owner explained, putting the harness on him at the same time. Oliver exhaled, and after him all the family stuck to the large window, not knowing how to help Oliver in such a non-trivial situation. In 3 minutes, Beatrice and Marion were outside, scratching Oliver's ears and neck with the permission of his owner. He rumbled, squinted his eyes, and growled softly. "What circus are you from?" Marion asked. "New York. We are neighbors with you. Mars is not wild, he was born here. But his mum Silva is a serious animal. If she came in here, God forbid, it'd be a big deal. And you come to our performances, I'll give you invitations as moral compensation." And she took Mars and went to the car. 2 minutes later, she returned with the invitations. "Thank you," thanked Marion, and the creative couple said goodbye and left. As they walked out, they bumped into Brian. "Oh my God, what is this? We're going to have a homeless girl living with a forest cat." "I don't mind," he said with a laugh. Marion hung on to Brian, laughing. Oliver looked at them and realized that he had done everything right in life. Otherwise, things would be different for him now. After all, children get bonuses from fate, not only for the sins of their parents, but also for their good deeds. A week later, Marcel was celebrating 2 weddings at once. The Kings had fully rented the restaurant. In the middle of the celebration, Jasper crept up to Annie, who was passionately discussing something with her tablemate, and barked in her ear. "Annie, marry me." She jumped up in her chair. "And you know I will," she replied with a laugh. "It will be my terrible revenge on all the male members of the male species," she said, and hugged the great age-old bully. Robert and Linda were discharged a month later, as promised, and they returned home. Oliver King offered him a good position in one of his companies. Life went on as usual. Fortunately, even in our difficult times, miracles happen, and there are happy people. The old man took in a refugee orphan, and when she went up to the study where he wouldn't let her in. When Mrs. Zendia, the neighbor, asked if Maggie could sleep alone that night, it was necessary to confess honestly that she could not. It was frightening to look at her grandmother's empty bed, and impossible not to. The silence was ringing. The surrounding silence was cutting to the ears. Who came up with this omen of stopping the clock in a house when a person dies in it? Grandmother loved her antique clock very much. Its quiet rustle, its soft sound. When Grandma brought little Maggie here, that clock had been here for a long time. Maggie had cried. The first night, Grandma sat on her bed and began to quietly comfort her. "You see, you and I are going to live well together, like girlfriends. I've chosen the coziest corner for your bed. Doesn't the clock bother you? Do you hear it? Maggie, Maggie, Maggie." Maggie quietly nudged the pendulum and cried silently. It couldn't be that Grandma was gone. When she had been told as a 6-year-old that Mommy and Daddy were dead, she hadn't believed it for a very long time. Somewhere they must be now, which means that someday they will come. That's why she flatly refused to leave their common home. She doesn't even remember why she agreed. I guess her grandmother managed to persuade her. Some miraculous way she knew how. At first, Maggie was terribly afraid that she would be taken away by some of the strangers who had appeared in the house after Mom and Dad disappeared. There wasn't a single evil person among them. It was just that they were all complete strangers. She was afraid to even cry in front of them, let alone answer questions. When they asked her something, she didn't just keep silent, but turned away just in case. That way they would get away from her faster, stop noticing her. One day some aunt pestered her. She said she had to go to daycare tomorrow. Maggie turned away and stared at the front door, pretending not to hear anything. Instead of Maggie, the aunt answered with some meaningless nonsense. Her neighbor, Mrs. Lee with the purple curly hair. I can honestly tell you that I'm not surprised. She's a very spoiled girl from Brooklyn. No one's been seriously involved in her upbringing. And just at that moment, the front door, at which Maggie was looking, opened, and a short, thin woman in blue jeans and white sneakers with blue flowers quietly entered, who heard everything, because she immediately answered something incomprehensible, though no one had time to ask her. Come on, you are such a close friend of the family to judge about it, and even more confidently express your opinion out loud. Mrs. Lee with the purple hair was loudly indignant. And I'm Maggie's grandmother, her father's mother. I haven't seen you around here, the woman replied. Grandma. Maggie shouted and rushed toward the stranger before she had time to think, just to escape immediately. Well, hello, Maggie. She heard a voice above her, and warm hands stroked her hair. That's right, it's her daddy's mom. She has the same kind and light hands. Daddy had said so often that Maggie had the kindest and most beautiful grandmother that Maggie couldn't wait to see her. She had long been promised to be taken far away to another town to visit her grandmother. And now Grandma had come herself and was just as Papa had described. Daddy never lied. After meeting Grandma, Maggie immediately stopped being afraid of all the terrible fears. It turned out that she and Grandma had no one but each other. Maggie was glad when she learned that it would be just the two of them. It's so good that it's just you and me, Grandma, with no strangers, the girl said. Grandpa would have loved you a lot too. You can be sure of that, Grandma smiled. She wasn't very happy that it was just the two of them with Maggie. There were many pictures of Grandpa in the house, but all in albums and only one on the wall. It showed a young dark-haired man, cheerful and strong, sitting in a boat, and on his lap he held a little boy, a little older than Maggie. The boy was very serious, frowning and gripping the oars tightly. Maggie recognized immediately that this boy was her daddy. They had pictures of him as a child at home, too. Grandma said here they were fishing on the Potomac River. It had been some very fishy summers, and they had had a terrific vacation. And in the early fall, 2 days after returning from vacation, Grandpa was killed in the line of duty. Little Maggie was afraid to ask what those duties were. And Grandma didn't explain the further family story, sad, but also beautiful in some ways. That story the grandmother revealed to the growing Maggie later. Matthew, the girl's father, grew up and left to study in Boston. To his mother's delight and relief, he had absolutely no desire to follow in his father's footsteps. Not drawn to any dangerous service, he simply enrolled as a project engineer. Thoughtful and focused, Matthew was very suited to this specialty. Everyone around him thought so too. No one expected any adventures from the guy. But he did. He fell in love with a girl from a wealthy family. And he didn't just fall in love for a while, he really fell in love. He was like that about everything. And so was the girl Bella. Her mother and stepfather were sure that sooner or later she would marry the son of a family friend, Eugene, with whom the stepfather had a business partnership. The guy was really very shallow, had been educated in England, had come back and was making a solid contribution to his father's business. He was in his early 30s. Financial prosperity was in sight. Why not get married? Mom and stepfather at first quietly, then more and more frankly and firmly began to push student Bella to a favorable, prosperous marriage. At first she joked, perhaps too careful and long, so that the family had time to realize that her refusal is not a whim of a spoiled princess. But it was time to speak seriously. Bella inhaled a little audibly, exhaled noisily, and announced, "The thing is, I have another fiancé." "Who is he?" languidly asked her mother, secretly hoping that the beautiful daughter went to her and knows how to find the best of the possible. And Bella's mother was disappointed, extremely disappointed. The groom turned out to be a young engineer, yesterday's university graduate, who got a job in a small construction firm. Well, he should be. It's not the richest who get the most money. Family makes all the difference. But the groom's mom was the widow of some provincial policeman. And so for the sake of this almost rustic, poor guy, Mom raised her beautiful Bella with clear skin, black eyebrows, and delicate green eyes like almonds. Love. But I had it, too, Mom said. I loved your father when I married him, but he got involved in some obscure project and left you and me penniless. If it hadn't been for Stephen, you'd have grown up in a communal flat. Stephen himself, Mom's husband and benefactor, was brief. Marry Eugene? It's been arranged. Mom was afraid of his strong statements, but Bella was not. She married her Matthew, and her parents kept their promise, cut her out of the family. Especially since they had another daughter growing up, little Olia. Their common daughter with Stephen, surely more successful and promising than Bella, who inherited only debts from her father. Grandmother said to Maggie, I pass on to you as your mother told me. I add nothing of my own. If you want, you can always look up your mother's side of the family. I once thought it was wrong that they weren't told of your birth. But when your parents died, my relatives were notified, just knowing about it just in case. And deciding for myself. There was nothing to decide here. No one came for Maggie except for Ashley's grandmother. So she had no one else. Now Grandma Ashley was gone. So no one at all alone in the whole wide world. If it wasn't for Archie. You knew Grandma was sick. Yeah, I know, she's not old. My mother's a little younger than your grandmother, as you know. But a bad heart is a bad heart. It can't be helped. You've got to get on with your life, not mourn endlessly. Archie comforted Maggie. He convinced her to go to New York. What's there to catch? He's a car mechanic, albeit a novice, but a good one, with excellent references. If Maggie rented out her and her grandmother's apartment, and he added his savings, and then quickly got a job, they could easily rent a small apartment in a bedroom community in New York City, and still have something to live on. Remember, I told you about my ideas before, but you were so afraid to leave your grandmother, you were glued to her. And now there's nothing keeping you here. Now Maggie really had nothing to hold her. She wouldn't have dared to go to a strange city alone. But New York was her mom's hometown. Plus Archie would be there, and she'd be with him. Aunt Zendaya shook her head. Oh, Maggie, I don't know. I'll help you rent the apartment. I'll supervise the tenants. But it's so little, barely enough for a room in New York. It's a different price of living there, everything. You're just out of college, you have zero experience. Before you get a job, what are you going to live on? At least you're at home here. And I'll always have a bowl of soup if you need it. Oh, Aunt Zendaya, Maggie waved her off. It's just the two of us. Archie's thought it over, and he's got some savings, and he'll find a job with his qualifications. We'll live no worse off than we do here. He knows he'll have to rely on him at first. Aunt Zendaya waved her hand back and forth. She got up from her chair, walked around the room in silence, and finally said, "It's your business, Maggie. The apartment is yours alone, and in that sense there's nothing to be afraid of. But I don't like these fashionable civil marriages without a rosary. It's old-fashioned. It's good and convenient for guys. All these, let's live and see, something does not suit. We'll sort it out, and there's nothing to share. What if you live with a new one every year? And for us girls, what's good in it? Not a wife and not a bride." Aunt Zendaya continued. "It's a trial, a temporary arrangement. What hope is there for him? It would be fine if he himself settled in the city, created a base, as they call it, and then pulled you with him. But no, he decided to stick to his grandmother's apartment, to make his life easier. And maybe you had a nice place of your own. Anyway, we're all our own people." The tactless mention of Grandma could have been taken offense to, but Maggie took no offense. Grandma Ashley would have understood, she said with conviction. Of course, she understood a lot more about relationships than the other adults. Maggie knew that for some reason, if Grandma had been alive, Maggie wouldn't have dared to move so far away from her, and now it didn't matter anymore. It was as if the stars had taken it upon themselves to help Maggie and Archie. Surprisingly, they found decent long-term tenants pretty quickly, a young couple with a toddler. Maggie had prepared in advance, sorted out and neatly stacked her grandmother's wrinkled belongings. She gave it to Aunt Zendaya for safekeeping. She took only her watch with her, though she sent that too into her suitcase in a cozy box, lovingly nestled between her warm sweaters. "They're so bulky. Why do you have to carry them with you?" Archie wondered. "I'm going to hang them in our apartment in New York, so we'll have something of our own," Maggie answered. "Well, if that's the way you want them," Archie agreed generously. In New York, too. Everything worked out as planned. A one-room apartment for the right price and a job for Archie were quickly found. True, the apartment was very cramped and far from the subway, and the job on the opposite side of the city. But that didn't matter much if you didn't pick on the little things. Maggie organized her closet and hung her grandmother's clock on the wall. She went shopping, boiled some borscht at home, and sat down at her laptop. She had to look for a job. Of course, she has no experience, but in college she took first place in hairdressing and creative competitions. Maggie has diplomas, and she agrees to the most modest salary, as long as there is an opportunity to gain experience. Returning from work, Archie several days in a row caught the same picture: a clean apartment. Lunch on the stove. Focused Maggie sends her resume to the salons. "We decided not to dwell on it," Archie said. "You'd think I couldn't provide for you on my own. I blame you and drive you to work. But it's not like that at all. As far as I'm concerned, you don't have to work at all. Not while we're renting at this price, anyway. And if they raise the price, you can raise the price for your tenants. I can't do that, Maggie sighed honestly. I told you how hard it was to rent my grandmother's and my grandmother's apartment. The only thing that made me feel better was that Eugene and Natasha were really nice guys. And their son Timmy is a wonderful, healthy baby who loves to smile and sing his long songs in his crib. I couldn't let anyone worse live in our apartment. And I can't raise the price on these people. You're my favorite little fool, Archie grinned patronizingly, hugging her. Okay, I'll take care of the problems myself, but I need you not to be busy and tired, but to wait for me at home with dinner. I'm really so tired in this car service that if you also come tired from some beauty salon, then on only bought dumplings I will not last long. I'm not quite settled here yet. I'm going to have to step it up a notch if I'm going to get anywhere. Why don't you stay home for a while? We thought it'd be easier and better that way. You've done such a good job organizing it like it's our own apartment. And you can walk around the city until midnight so you don't get bored while I'm at work. Other girls wish their boyfriend would support them. And you like the workday, the job, the whimsy? Maggie was embarrassed. Indeed, she'd earn a pittance and deprive her Archie of a fresh lunch and dinner every day. If they don't squander the money, they can get by. It's not like she's going to go to the theaters and concerts. That's fine. They'll get along just fine without her earnings. Summer came, and Archie's assurance that she had nothing to work for now came in very handy. Although it was a cool, windy summer with frequent rain, it was still a beautiful summer. The city no longer seemed unprincipled and gray to Maggie when there was thick shade, fresh green in the parks. And the river didn't look so stark anymore. One day Maggie went into the Museum of Natural History and didn't notice herself spending 3 hours there. At dinner, she told Archie about it. Let's go together again this weekend. I didn't have time to look at and memorize everything. And then we'll go somewhere else. Why did we come here if we can't see anything? We came here to earn, not to spend, Archie explained condescendingly. I can see it all later, if I want to. Archie was working hard and saving money for some important plans, which he promised to tell me about later. Vivian, a neighbor on the floor, with whom Maggie had become friends, thought that Maggie was lucky to have Archie. Your husband's a hard worker. He's got a lot of determination for his age. He'll bring everything into the house, I can tell. You know how infantile guys are these days. Take my Kieran. We've had a son for 2 years, and for my husband the main thing is his friends, his company. They always have to rush to help at the first call, no matter what his wife has other plans. She is not bored with the child. Son is always fun. Most of them are selfish. So you've still got a good one. Although you're pretty, Maggie could find someone better, not someone who wouldn't take you out, but not a sure thing. So yeah, your Archie thing is pretty good. Maggie, after Vivian had talked about her options, felt uncomfortable complaining that she was missing something. She had a very different idea of their life in the big city. She felt like they'd been together for 100 years. And Archie no longer loved her the way he used to. He comes home from work tired, often irritable over nothing, lying on the couch waiting for food, and he looks at Maggie as if she were something ordinary, as if she always had been and always would be, like a radiator. It's true that he changes at night, especially before the weekend, remembering affectionate words, promising to think of something interesting for the vacation. I guess it's the fatigue, the worry. Will he be able to achieve something in a foreign city, in a megalopolis? It's certainly hard to settle in. After all, Archie works alone for 2 people. Everything is getting more expensive so fast, and the landlord hints at a pay rise. We'll have to find a job after all. At first, Archie will grumble, but then he'll realize that it's better this way, and I'm busy. I don't have time to be bored and think of silly things. And it will be interesting, because a hairdresser is a man of art, my favorite profession. Maggie thought about it, consulted with Vivian, and decided to try another tactic of job search. Nothing comes of sending out resumes listing children's contest prizes from college. When you have no experience at all, there are probably 1,000 girls sending out 1,000 resumes at the same time. Go to the neighborhood salons yourself, Vivian advised her grandmother's old method. But in your profession, it can work. A hairdresser has to be personable. When I first saw you, I thought lucky for us that the neighbor's such a nice girl rented an apartment. So walk around. smile, and socialize. Maggie thought it might help. In the expensive luxury salon from the street, of course, will not take, but in a simple barbershop, as they have in their town at the bathhouse, quite possible. And Maggie, having hardly waited for Archie to leave for work, set off in search of happiness. There were plenty of salons and establishments with a modest barbershop sign nearby. 4 salons didn't show the slightest interest in her, but at a tiny, modest, semi-basement salon with the glamorous name Orchid, the bored brunette perked up after a brief conversation with Maggie. "Oh, I need a replacement immediately. My assistant is not a bad girl, but she has a tumultuous personal life and is unreliable. It's not about her at all. She has to be replaced all the time. The boss doesn't care which one of us works, as long as it's not at a loss. I'm really sick of this unpredictability, and it's useless to talk. I can see you're different. If I put a question to the owner, either me or Olia, he will ask her, because he knows very well who is worth what here. He doesn't pay much, so he doesn't have the nerve to count on a supermaster. It's just convenient that I live 1 floor up. I'd have looked for something better a long time ago. But it's convenient for picking up my daughter from school. It's a local neighborhood. Same grandmothers and aunts for years. The demands aren't too fancy. I'm sure you've been practicing on the same neighbors back home. Yeah, well, nothing unexpected. Leave me your phone number. I'll call you when I need to fill in. My name is Rita. I promise to get you ready." Maggie liked the confident Rose, but for some reason the air in the semi-basement Orchid seemed musty, sickly sweet, dizzy and nauseous. She politely said goodbye and hurried outside, where she barely made it to the corner of the house before vomiting into the grass. Maggie felt a little better, but suddenly she felt a strange weakness, as if all her strength had gone at once. She was even a little frightened and decided not to go home, but first to Vivian. "Via V, I think I might get a job, but it's a long shot," she said from the doorway. "Are you so pale?" Vivian marveled at the look on her face. Maggie sighed and told her what had happened to her. Vivian shook her head thoughtfully. "I don't want to scare you. It's better to test right away and eliminate the assumption. I have a pregnancy test lying around in my medicine cabinet." "What kind of test?" Maggie didn't understand. "Are you 100% sure you can't be pregnant?" "Then I'm jealous." Vivian waved her hands. "Do you think we're from the middle of nowhere?" "Of course we're using protection. Archie himself." Maggie smiled, not used to discussing such things. "Yeah, I believe every word you say," Vivian nodded. "When people say to me, 'How handsome Greg is,' I say, 'What do you want?' It's electronically verified. We were planning for later, like 5 years from now. But he had his own way. You found it, take a test and don't think about horrors in advance. Maybe there's nothing. Or maybe there is, but it'll be fine." Maggie hadn't thought to ask Vivian how best to break the news to Archie. Hints were silly, it should be direct, but at the right moment, not from the doorstep, but when Archie had eaten dinner and rested a little. She waited until nightfall. And when the lights went out, she whispered in a half-whisper, "Archie, I'm pregnant. I'm sure you are. The smells in the barbershop made me sick. Vivian gave me a test and it showed 2 stripes. "Oh, really? You're not kidding me." Archie stretched out lovingly. "You know I don't get such stupid jokes." "I'm serious. Vivian told me that they also had a baby despite the measures. It's not uncommon. I will try to edit the text, keeping its basic content and style, replacing names and cities with American ones, dividing it into paragraphs, emphasizing dialogues and eliminating phraseology. No method could be completely trusted." Maggie didn't know what to say next. She fell silent, and silence hung. Only the ticking of the clock on the wall. Why was Archie silent too? He's gathering his thoughts. Now he's going to put his arm around her, say, "Don't worry, we'll get through this. I don't see the problem. I'll take care of it." It must have been half an hour before Maggie decided to speak again. "Archie, it scares me when you don't talk like that." "Maggie, I don't mean to say it's your fault alone. So you go to the doctor tomorrow and find out how much it'll cost to get it stopped quickly. And I'll give you whatever you need from my savings." It was as if she'd heard a completely alien voice. Maggie reached out a shivering, frozen hand, fumbled for the lamp switch, and turned on the light, as if she wanted to make sure it was her Archie. It was him. And he shielded himself from the light with his hand. "Well, what have you done to me now?" "Well, you're not hysterical. Are you going to tell me you want a baby? That doesn't make any sense. Why would we want one, especially now?" Maggie tried to catch his gaze, but he shivered with his palm and curved his mouth in displeasure. Her ability to speak suddenly returned to her. "I didn't want anyone, because I just didn't think about it. I can't abort. If I already have a child, I'll love it. My grandmother told me my father was happy when he found out I was coming. Although he and my mom had nothing at that time, he just loved her very much. So he loved their child right away. That is me. Of course, your dad's a noble knight, and I'm a scoundrel. Did you ever think that he hoped to make peace with his rich wife's family by having a child? No. And that's life, baby." Maggie silently slipped into her flip-flops, went into the kitchen, and cried with her head on the table. Whether her daddy was counting on something or not, he still wouldn't be able to clean it up quickly, so to speak. Maggie knows for a fact that daddy couldn't have done that. She carried a small photograph behind her passport cover. There, Matthew and Nellie are squatting, holding the handles on either side of a tiny little girl in a crimson jumpsuit who has just learned to walk. "Daddy, Mommy." "I don't have anyone else to support me," Maggie whispered. Stop whimpering, she heard a good-natured voice above her. "Go to bed. Tomorrow, if you're afraid, they'll take you to the doctor." "Well, I'm sorry about that. Soon you won't even remember it." "I'm not getting rid of the baby." "Of course you're in favor of creating poverty. I could have guessed that when you were picking up stray cats with kittens." "But I'm not a stray." Maggie interrupted him quietly. "Look, why don't you get some sleep, calm down, and then we'll talk sensibly in the morning. I'm tired as a dog at work, and there's drama at home. I'm going to go sleep somewhere. If you want to talk without drama, call me." Maggie watched Archie silently as he folded his things without looking at her and threw his underwear and clothes into his gym bag. "Don't worry, he'll play free wolf, cool down, and come back. He'll apologize. The main thing is to keep your tail pistol and everything with him. And first pretend to be mortally offended and convinced that perfectly well do without him," exhorted and admonished Maggie Vivian. "I don't have to pretend I'll get along just fine without him, if not fine." "You'll have to get along awfully well," Maggie assured her grimly. "Why are you so downhearted?" Vivian continued to comfort her, not very confidently. Maggie interrupted her. "I'm sorry, friend, you're the best. But don't do this. He doesn't need me. I saw it last night. I don't know why I didn't see it before. Not when I was handy, when he needed me. Aunt Zendasia was right. If I didn't have the money from selling my grandmother's apartment, he wouldn't have brought me here with him. He'd have left alone, promised to come back for me, and disappeared." Archie was gone. Maggie couldn't take it anymore and burst into tears, crying and angry at herself for not being able to hold back her tears. It was as if Vivian had read her mind. "That's right. Don't be shy with me, Cry. How much do you need? You'll calm down quicker that way. I know what I'm talking about. We fools believe we're loved, that they'll take care of us. Sometimes we're lucky not to be wrong, but often we're not." Archie never came back. Calming down, if you could call her confused state that, Maggie looked around the apartment and realized there were no things left in it for him to come back for. All the little things they had managed to acquire for the house mattered only to Maggie herself. Archie had taken his clothes. Now he was probably staying with the single Kieran, whom he had made friends with at his new job. He so enjoyed the coziness and the dinners Maggie cooked from his grandmother's recipes with imagination. Was he so scared of the baby that he was even willing to sacrifice his comfort? Maggie endured a full week and dialed his number after all. "The subscriber's phone is switched off or out of range," the mechanical voice reported. "Maybe we should go see him at work," after all, Vivian reasoned aloud, trying to dispel Maggie's confusion. "Would you like me to ask Kieran? He won't say no. He's such a chatterbox. It's not hard for him to talk man to man. At least find out how your Archie's feeling." Maggie looked up at her. She'd lost weight, her face strained. If in the last week, the already troubled green-brown eyes seemed huge on him. And like that, as if you couldn't see it yet, she said tiredly, "Maybe he's not sure yet. Do you know how cowardly they really are?" "Yeah," Maggie said with a strained smile. "I'm all out of money. I'm out of the deposit from the sale of my grandmother's apartment, which I used to pay for this place. If I keep spending that money, I won't be able to pay the landlord anytime soon. Next month already. There is, of course. But I can't." "I want to cry so badly," Maggie said tiredly. "And Archie knows how the money is, and he doesn't care." "What have you decided about the baby?" Vivian asked cautiously. "I don't know what to decide. I wouldn't forgive myself. It's not a question of the child itself, but what will live on when it's born, and I can't work yet. I have no one, Vivian. I don't even have anyone to come and babysit while I work. And I can't get rid of him. Don't look at me like that. I can't, that's all. I think it would be worse then than it is now." Vivian walked through the kitchen, looked in the spice jars, and said, "If your creep doesn't show up, you can always go home. At least there are all those aunts there who were friends with your grandmother will help you with something. But it's the last resort to go back penniless. You're still a little young. Could you have time to get a job here in St. Petersburg? Ideally officially, of course, with maternity leave and everything." Employers don't like that. When everything becomes clear, they say that a pregnant woman got a job on purpose. But they have their own truth, you have yours. You need to live, and they don't care. But with your profession and no experience, it may not work out that way. So at least you got something. I'll always buy you a meal and feed you. You won't go hungry, that's for sure. If you don't spend your paycheck but save up some money here and come back to your town with a small reserve for the first time. Or maybe you'll be lucky enough to find something decent. Then you'll stay in St. Petersburg as long as you want. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I'd do if I were you. A job first, and then we'll see." Maggie thought that's what she'd do. She just did. Half an hour later, her cell phone rang. "Maggie, hi. Listen, I'm not going to tell you over the phone, but I think I have something for you," said Rita from Orchid. Here's what the edited text might look like. Rose reported, "Our Richard wants to see you. He promised to be at the salon by about 3 p.m., so you better hurry up too." "Should I bring my papers?" Maggie asked. "Yes, I doubt he'll look at your papers right away," Rose said. "Well, take your passport just in case, and don't pretend to be a foreigner, like a Czech. It's not like I have any idea what he's going to get in his head from our unpredictable boss." Unpredictable. That's not very reassuring, Maggie thought. But there was no choice. Good thing she looked good that day. Maggie washed her hair, did her makeup thoroughly, dressed in one of her newest casual dresses, and even wore heeled sandals, even though she usually wore more comfortable shoes. By 3 o'clock, she was at the salon. The director had to wait another half hour. Maggie was having coffee with Rose and one of the clients from the next door, a bright, fresh-faced, red-haired, cheerful lady. "The bosses aren't late, the bosses are late, girls," she announced, making funny grimaces. She entertained Maggie and Rose with amusing stories. It wasn't boring at all. But when the principal did arrive, the cheerful client quickly said goodbye and left. Margaret, instead of gossiping, would have cleaned the place up for once. I'm not talking about superficial cleaning. I'm talking about real cleanliness. I can't believe you don't have time. "I can tell from the receipts that I have time," he said instead of greeting, without anger, with lazy irritation. Richard was a thick, stocky, middle-aged man in a brightly colored Hawaiian shirt that was a little tight around the stomach. "Richard, have a cheerful outlook on life. Is something wrong?" "Just yesterday I was your smarty pants girl," Rose said with a smile. "Is this the girl you were telling me about?" He changed the subject. "Yes, that's Maggie, a certified hairdresser with diplomas, certificates. Let's give it a shot. This girl really needs a job. She's just dying for a job. She's serious, she won't ask for time off. Right, Maggie?" Yes, Maggie confirmed, trying to be convincing. Here's what the edited text might look like. "Hello, please take me on probation," Richard said. Maggie's girlfriend brown-eyed. "I'm blonde," he hummed, giving Maggie a friendly, quick glance. "But the thing is, I don't need another hairdresser. I'd also try to get an experienced one and see if she's any better than these. I'm not messing with you." "Why did you ask me to come?" Maggie asked, confused. "Rose was very complimentary about you. I wanted to see if you'd be a good fit. I have a restaurant besides this place. I need another waitress now, a pretty and smart one." "Is it urgent?" "I mean, people are hiring," Maggie said. "I don't have much time, and I don't really want to waste time. If it suits you, you'll make money. The tips are pretty good over the summer, as far as I know. We'll see in the fall. I'll tell you right away, I won't make it official. It's not profitable for me. I have a lot of such establishments. In the fall, there will be fewer tourists. Maybe we'll have to fire half of them. It's a seasonal job, as usual. I'm on my way there right now. I can take you with me. See if you like it. Then we can talk about shift pay." "Yeah, thanks for the offer." "Sure, I'll go," Maggie agreed right away. What's the point of acting out in a situation like this? How long would she look for a job in her specialty before her position really became apparent? Would she ever find one? She could end up with nothing. At least there's a chance. Rose nodded at her behind Richard's back and waved her hand affirmatively. It's the right thing to do. And before Maggie knew it, she was already working in Violet for the 4th week. Yes, that was the name Richard and his partner Pete had. The restaurant was in the same semi-basement as the Orchid, only larger. There was 1 cook and an assistant and 2 waitresses per shift. One of the girls had recently graduated from university and decided to change the job she'd held onto while she was a student. Maggie was hired in her place. The restaurant was quite cozy, frequented, inexpensive, and the place was quite lively. The food was good. Another plus at work, they fed, of course not the same as the clients, simpler and cheaper. Pasta or potatoes with a meat portion, wieners or a chicken leg. At first Maggie was very happy, no need to spend on food on weekdays, again saving money. But more and more often there were days when every trip to the kitchen for an order became a feat for her. The mere smell of food made her nauseous. Not even the most appetizing dish from the banquet menu, let alone a company meal. Maggie worked shifts 2 days a week from 11 to 11 p.m. And you'd never guess in the morning how the shift would go. You'd fly from morning till night and chew on cabbage, carrots, and apples all day. Or barely crawl, holding onto the wall and trying not to look at the food, coming to the kitchen for an order. The doctor at the women's clinic, where Maggie registered for temporary registration, explained she has toxicosis. It happens a lot, but it's not a big deal. It should pass soon. I wish it would go away soon, Maggie thought. When the cook Vince is on shift, she's more relaxed. He doesn't notice anything, like all the guys. Thinking it's not a big deal, the girl didn't sleep well. But Sarah, or Sarah Lindsay as she called herself, looked at her suspiciously, as if she'd guessed it all long ago. Maggie tried not to think about it, remembering her friend Vivian's admonition. "You need to take care of your nerves now, or you'll have a lot of trouble later with a nervous child. It's just a job. You do it and you go. You don't care what anyone thinks." Vivian herself knew how to do that. She'd recently gotten out of maternity leave, returned to her accounting department, and talked about her boring boss with a laugh, no hard feelings. Maybe it was a good thing the heat was a rarity in New York that summer. It was hard to bear with the humidity here. Or was it just Maggie now? But one day on the shift it got unbearable. Nothing. It would soon be over. She ran into the locker room, behind which was the restroom, and tore off the top 2 buttons of her white work blouse to keep it from getting dirty. As she was about to get up and go to the gym, she heard behind her, "You don't make any sudden movements, girl. There are only 2 tables. Natalie can handle it without you. Let's make some peppermint tea. It helps. I've got a lot of mint growing in my garden. I'll give it to you at home if you want it. Ginger tea helps with that too, and you should eat it. You should eat more often and sleep longer." Sarah looked at Maggie without laughing, but also without pity, with calm understanding and sympathy. For some reason Maggie felt not scared, but much relieved that she had punctured herself after all. In 10 minutes in the kitchen, while she drank mint tea, she told Sarah Lindsay her whole story. "The usual story," she said. "Svet, are you going to take the groceries? Pete asked behind her back. Ah, hello, Svetlana Borisovna. Sarah Lindsay in turn asked in a deliberately mocking tone. Maggie even forgot that she felt sick and realized with sober horror that Pete could have heard their conversation. This companion of Richard's, young, thin, and noiseless, frightened her very much for some reason. Unpleasant, always coming unheard, such was his gait. With cooks still sometimes greets, even something else will say. And waitresses in general about the furniture, even a word never dignifies never. Maggie jumped up at his discovery and happily clung to the elbow of Natalie, who had appeared in the kitchen. Oh, Natasha, let's go for a second. Come on, what did you get out of Natalie? As soon as they were out of the door, you'd think a little bit in the kitchen. There's not a full house in the auditorium. That Pitlick's probably the main one, and he's just acting like it. In the evening, Richard arrived in another Hawaiian shirt, and with a particularly heavy smell of booze for Maggie. He called Maggie. In the room, he accountant kitchen, office of the incoming accountant calculator. Examined the girl squeamishly and tiredly held out an envelope. Your payment for the month. I check everything honestly. You don't work anymore, he said. Why? Maggie asked with just her lips. How insolent modern girls are, especially from the suburbs like you. What makes you think you have the right to lie and set someone up when you've been stupid enough to get pregnant? Something will happen to you at work, and you will go to some labor inspectorate. You will tell how the bastard director did not register you for work, exploited you, and you will demand maternity money. I will not scold you and scare you, so that you do not immediately faint to me. I'm just asking you nicely for now, be quiet, and don't try to pull something like that. He was almost friendly, without anger. A smooth, lazy voice. Maggie had a lot of things she wanted to say, but she kept quiet. She wanted to throw his money at him, but she took the envelope silently. It would come in handy. It wasn't even for her. Let's really report the bastard, Vivian suggested. You want me to report him for poisoning at his diner? Yeah, they'd just fire Sarah, Lena, or Vince. Maggie waved her head. Yeah, that's a no-go. Oh, we'll get the IRS on him. I'll tell them they didn't give him a check twice for service, or the health department, or the fire department. I mean, what's the one thing he can't get enough of? Vivian, I won't feel better if he feels worse, Maggie admitted. I would, honestly, said Vivian. They wouldn't let her rest in her own apartment after work, Kieran's husband muttered. They're all intrigue. Kieran couldn't tell whether he was joking or serious. The next day, Maggie slept most of the day. She woke twice, drank strong tea in the kitchen, and went back to bed. Nothing wanted to do, nothing to think about. It was as if a dark curtain had fallen over her eyes. In the evening, Vivian rang the doorbell. Come to our place. Oh, come on, Kieran will be nagging you and me. He's calling you himself. He wants to tell you something. He didn't send it through me, Vivian announced. Kieran was in the kitchen eating soup from a deep bowl. Maggie, I found out something for you. Maybe it'll be good for you. My buddy Eugene finishing. He just did a remodel on a private house in the suburbs for a grandfather. It's a nice house, but he lives alone. He's taken a liking to his colleague. He sees that he's a normal, honest guy, and shared that he would rent a room to a woman, if for the usual household help and to be his companion, so even for free. You know, for errands and conversation. That's the deal. A favor for a favor. His living conditions are very good. He's not picky about cleaning and cooking. He told me so himself. Maybe he's crazy. Maggie interrupted incredulously. Eugene says exactly normal, the right grandfather. Just alone and with money. He says he can always get it through an agency, but he doesn't trust them very much. That's why he's asking everyone he knows to recommend him. I thought of you right away. Lying again? Maggie asked tiredly. Suddenly a good man, he expects a quiet old age. And suddenly I'm having a baby, and if I find a job again, how will I have time to do his errands? Then you'll have to pay for the room like you're supposed to. And listen, Maggie, don't confuse me. I'm not Sherlock Holmes. I'm a slow thinker. Come on. And Eugene will tell him honestly that this is your situation. It's probably the right thing to do. Let him decide for himself. Yes or no? Maggie nodded. Even Kieran wanted to help her. She'd thought he hated her for hanging around their house. That didn't make sense. I don't think this is going to work. But you have to say thank you and pretend you're hopeful. So she did. Kieran went to his Eugene. Vivian exhaled noisily and suggested, "Let's have some cherry pie. We'll sit up for the night." Vivian suggested, "If you're really hungry, we could do it once." What do you think, Maggie? Maybe something good could come out of this. Go and see it. You've got nothing to lose. Just take a good look at the landlord. He's a cunning old man. Instead of hiring a housekeeper for a salary, he's looking for a tenant who'll do the same duties for a room. Don't be shy. Just ask directly what exactly you have to do. Maybe it's a lot of work. What? It's easier to rent a room for money than to do it all every day. Honestly, I couldn't do it. Sometimes I'm ready to throw something heavy at my chief accountant for her nagging. And there's a million reasons for nagging. But it's still worth a look. On his first day off, Kieran took Maggie to meet the grandfather who rented out the room. According to him, the grandfather was not confused by Maggie's story. He didn't even ask anything. Vivian had planned to contact her husband and friend, thinking of a good excuse to go out with the child in the country. But the baby was sick, feverish and cranky, and they didn't have time for a walk. For some reason, Maggie imagined a large wooden house in a clearing like merchant estates from movies about old life. But the house turned out to be brick and faced with stone without any curlicues, but very stylish and beautiful. It was surrounded by a small garden, a few apple and cherry trees without a trace of beds and flower beds. This through the fence could be seen at once. The fence was not a blank brick wall, but a wrought metal one. The elegant gate was ajar, but Kieran was too shy to enter and called on his cell phone. "Greg, this is Kieran from Eugene. I brought Maggie's girl to see your room." "Ah, good, let's go inside, Maggie." As they walked along the stone-paved path toward the house, the front door opened, and the owner himself appeared, holding a large and very shaggy white dog by the collar. From under his bangs, he was scrutinizing Maggie and Kieran. "This is Archie. He's peaceful. As long as he doesn't attack us," Master said. Master continued, "So don't be afraid of him for a minute if you're not going to attack him. And I'm Greg." One had to look closely at his face to realize that the host was well into his 70s, covered with a grid of wrinkles where deep and sharp, where thinner and smaller. His gaze was quick and sharp, not senile, but it was softened by the rays of wrinkles near his eyes. "Not mean," Maggie breathed out quietly. And if you didn't look at his face, you'd never think he was an old man. He had the posture of a middle-aged man with a gaunt figure and no hint of decrepitude. Completely graying silver hair was cut very short, a neat beard. Greg invited them into the house. So respectable on the outside, the house turned out to be cozy, but a little unusual on the inside. Of course, it was obvious from the many signs that a woman's hand had not been here for a long time, although the owner obviously keeps order. But the main thing was that the house was as if several different eras had come together. So different was the furniture, even the bedspreads and curtains. In the spacious hallway on the first floor, XXI century, and in the living room as if the 19th. Even Maggie, who knew a little about antiques, could tell that the furniture was antique. She faltered, "I guess it's rude to look at everything so closely." Kieran took a seat on the edge of the guest sofa at his host's suggestion and kept modestly quiet. "I suppose you want to see the room at once, Maggie?" Greg asked. "Have you already decided that I'm the right person for you?" Maggie was surprised and confused. "Have you decided that I'm not the right person for you?" The landlord laughed. "Don't be so quick to judge. Let's see the room. It's right here on the first floor. I myself live on the second floor. There's an office and a bedroom. The rest of the space is abandoned. It's just a bunch of old archives. I'm sorting it out, but it's a little light. If you'd like to keep me company, I'd really appreciate it. Of course, if you're interested." Here's how it went down. Greg opened the light beige silent door. "This is the room. Come in, Maggie." A square room, the window looked out into a cozy corner of the garden. It seemed very warm and cozy, though the only furniture was an old chest of drawers, a small table with a mirror, and a bed. "We'll find a closet for dresses," said the owner. "Curtains. If you don't like them, change them. The main thing is not to tear down the load-bearing walls, and the rest is negotiable, solvable." Maggie remembered the most important thing. "Greg, I like the room. You just tell me all your conditions in detail at once. You told Eugene that you're renting the place out for household help, and I'd like to know what my duties will be. I'm conscientious. But you know I'm having some difficulties." "What a businesslike girl you are," smiled the owner. "Your difficulties, as you put it, do not interfere with me. Maybe it will sound strange what I will say, but try to understand. I know you have no one. I don't have anyone either. I could hire a pro housekeeper, but I don't want an uncomfortable stranger's professional servant person in the house anymore. I don't have a need for the house to be perfectly cleaned, like for a magazine, and to be serviced like a luxury hotel. I need a live-in person in the house. I like you a lot, and I don't like all people. Household chores without the fanaticism. The same things you'd do if I were your dad or your grandfather living under the same roof. A little bit at a time, depending on your mood. Just so you're sure, this isn't charity. This kind of work is worth about the price of a house. If you help with the archives, that would be the most wonderful thing. I'll pay you like a secretary for that." Maggie had imagined her conversation with the landlord differently, and she had imagined him differently while she was on her way here. It seemed suspicious that things are working out so well. All right, she'll probably find out the pitfalls later. Here's the edited text. "Greg, when can we move into the room?" Maggie asked. "If your friend Kieran will drive up and down to get your things, you can go today," Greg said. "I'll give you some money to stop by and buy us dinner and a housewarming party." "Yes, I'll make dinner," Maggie promised. "Let's go ask Kieran." It turned out that archives were not dusty and boring papers that made me sleepy. Documents are a very interesting thing, like reading a screenplay. Only it was all real. Especially the diaries. They were alive, like enchanted narrow books. When there were no computers and not everyone had a typewriter, people simply wrote down their thoughts with a pen on paper, and even earlier, they transcribed them into ordinary school notebooks, or beautiful thick volumes that contained whole lives. And people had enough time for that, despite the fact that there were almost no household appliances. And life itself was no easier than it is now. As Greg said, life had simplified and lost a lot. No, there's a lot of good things now, but the old good things had better stay. It was very interesting with him in general. Vivian was worried that Maggie was bored out there on the outback with her old grandfather and called for her to come and visit them more often on weekends. Maggie was happy to come, and she took a couple of walks around New York with little Greg, and then she was just as happy to come back. "Oh, all right, my bunnies, I've got to go home," she said last Saturday, surprised at herself. With Vivian, she already thought of this house and the room in it as her real home, the one she had lived in long ago, and it was as if her grandmother's pictures had always hung on that wall opposite her bed. Where did Greg put them? "Not picking on you, Grandpa?" Vivian asked. "About the variety on the menu or anything else? Not putting things in the wrong place, not neat enough or lazy?" "What kind of complaints can grandfathers have?" Maggie laughed. "Probably like my Kieran, only twice as much because of his age." "To be honest, it's hard for me to imagine Greg as a picky old man," laughed Maggie. "As it happens, I don't do anything heavy at all. But I do the same basic things I did when I lived with my grandmother. Dinner, simple cleaning, and Greg takes away my cleaning supplies. If you imagine I should be tired by now. And Greg always spoils me with goodies," she continued. "He says he bought it for himself, but he barely touches it. Vivian, he's not a typical grandfather." There was a story, Maggie said. There lived a regular old Soviet professor, invented various innovations for the Soviet industry and for the military. And he had two favorite students, both of whom had been working with him for many years, and shortly before the collapse of the Soviet Union. He started some serious project and hoped very much to advance it. One of his students worked with him on the technical part of the project, and the other one, more persuasive and dodgy, ran through all sorts of instances to get funding, or some permits. "For me, these technical scientific works are just a dark forest," Maggie admitted. "I only realized one thing about them: they are very long. and the result is not always as you expect. And while these companions were working, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and the funding ran out. Soon there would be nothing to travel on. It was unclear who would pay for the work in general, even if from home all the valuable things in the pawn shop. And when everything was ready, one of the student companions disappeared. The one who was a punching bag, I guessed. Yeah, that's what happened, Maggie nodded. Took all the developments with him and took off. That's the way it was going. He went to the West, patented his invention, provided for himself and his children for life. And these two honest martyrs of science professors almost had a stroke. He was ill for a long time, barely survived, and when he got back on his feet, his wife also took him to the States, persuaded him. She had a close relative living there and married very successfully. And the second student stayed here in New York. Here is the edited continuation of the text. At first he thought he'd go to sleep, Maggie continued, and then somehow it all worked out. Talent, he does find a loophole. He met the right person from the New Russians, but very smart. He began to work for this man, a whole production he thought up and earned good money back in the 90s, and then also received an inheritance from the States. It turns out that his favorite friend, a professor, still had time to work there but for himself, said Maggie. And the professor had no children. He wrote such a will, half of the property to his wife, half to his student and colleague Greg, where I live. This old archive we're going through right now is the professor, she explained. Greg dragged it everywhere with him, since it was left to him, and his last name. The antique furniture was left to him. The professor and his wife could have sold it before they left. It's not cheap. But the professor wanted to leave at least something valuable as a memento of himself to his student. He felt he'd let him down with his earnings and recognition. And when Greg bought the house, he moved everything there. And now he lives surrounded by those memories, Maggie continued. And the archive wants to dismantle and hand over some of his favorites, as if he owed it to his teacher, so that someone here would remember him. That's the life of people, Vivian waved her head. Even intelligence isn't a guarantee that you'll live a problem-free life. Listen, why is your Greg alone if there are no heirs around such a wealthy grandfather? So you're right. He's got no one. There's something about him. Unless some auntie's got her hands on him. Vivian, he doesn't mention that at all. I don't ask, said Maggie. Maybe if he asked me something personal, I would. But he doesn't ask me either. I think he's embarrassed. He's been brought up to mind his own business. It's complicated with intellectuals, Vivian confirmed with a knowing look, as if she talked to professors every day. Maybe on the contrary, it's easier to live like that, if you follow all these rules? Vivian thought aloud. I won't make predictions, so as not to jinx it, but so far you seem to be lucky. You even look prettier, even though you're digging through dusty archives. Yeah, I looked like you when I moved in, didn't I? Maggie agreed. Look, I'm not an intellectual, I'll ask you. Have you heard from Artem? Vivian, I would have told you first. I don't have anyone in New York besides you, Bones and Greg. Greg rarely forgot anything, and now, when he volunteered to help Maggie peel apples for jam, it turned out that he forgot his glasses in the office, probably left them on the keyboard of his laptop. I'll be right there. Let me run in myself. I want to run up the stairs, Maggie said. She had only been in the office a few times. It was Greg's diocese. As he put it, I'm the master and manager here. Occasionally he'd do a little rearranging the books on the shelves or some figurines. Now on his antique bureau desk next to his laptop, besides his glasses, a chessboard with bone chess and a small photograph in a thin wooden frame had been left behind. Maggie hadn't noticed any photos in the office before, at least not in prominent places. In the black and white amateur photo, a little girl with 2 ponytails on top of her head is lying on the sand in a swath of sea surf, laughing and hugging a large striped bouncy ball. Maggie remembered every detail of that photo very well. She had one just like it in her backpack, in the same folder with her passport, diploma, and the few expensive photos. Greg, where did you get that photo of the girl at sea? Maggie asked, forgetting her embarrassment as she went down to the kitchen and handed the landlord her glasses. That's the picture I took. I was into photography, Greg replied, looking anxiously into Maggie's face, as if listening to her strange mood. That's my daughter, Nellie. Maggie looked at the picture of little Nellie hugging a large bouncy ball, and her voice trembled slightly. I carry a picture like that with me. It came here with me too. That's my mom, Nellie. Greg nodded sadly. Yes, Nellie Vitalievna was my wife. A good memory is far from always a blessing. She's a curse sometimes. Memories came flooding back. The beautiful Angela, whom he had adored until their last day together, had suddenly become a complete stranger. She looked even more beautiful, but it was a manicured, magazine beauty that was scary to touch. I don't want the child to flip back and forth, Angela said in her gentle voice. It will be easier for her to forget you and get used to a new father. Vitaly takes good care of her and wants me to call him Daddy. She'll have everything you could never give her. Do you know how much Nellie loves me? Greg asked painfully. You dared such a despicable fiction to make a child feel betrayed by her own father. She had already stopped caring. Children forget things quickly, Angela replied. When she's an adult, she'll understand me as a woman. If you come up with the idea of showing up, it will only be worse for her. Greg sighed. Yes, you've studied me pretty well. I won't tell my daughter that her mother easily denigrated her father. At least let her mom stay good to her. Thank you, Maggie said. I knew you'd understand, Greg. I'm not filing for child support. I know how hard this is for you. Thank you, he chuckled through gritted teeth. He turned and walked away. I didn't know where, just away. He didn't recognize anything else, and he'd never looked for anyone. He himself could no longer answer who he was protecting more, his daughter or himself, and he made a terrible mistake. Had he found his daughter in time, there would have been someone to support her when her mother had turned her away because his Nellie had chosen an unfavorable husband. And Maggie's granddaughter would have had someone to support her and his son-in-law's sainted mother. Maybe Maggie's only real grandmother would still be alive if her heart had paid for serious treatment. But history does not bear the subjunctive mood. As his teacher and colleague used to say, now you have to move on and live a long time, because soon there will be another tenant in the house who will have to be taken care of for a long time until he can take care of himself. And to live long, easy and pleasant when you have someone to live for. Vivian's voice was a little strained, and she didn't call in the evening as usual, but on her lunch hour. Maggie, would you mind if I came straight over after work today? Yeah, nothing's wrong. Everything's fine. Just in the mood to see you and chat. There's some little things I need to tell you. Yes, come over, of course, Maggie said. Especially since Grandpa's going to a class reunion at the Institute, and he's worried about how we're going to be alone for so long. What if we need something in his absence, and he's not here? I'll at least reassure him that we won't miss him. Oh, great. Considering all the traffic, I'll be at your place by 8 p.m., Vivian promised. Maggie sent her grandfather a wet asphalt suit for the weekend, tied his tie, approved his gentlemanly image, and escorted him to the meeting. He waved a long time after the cab. Back at the house, Maggie put on her cash and went out into the garden with it. In the far sunny corner under the apple trees, unnoticeable from the road, they had a real nest. Grandfather had hung a baby cocoon hammock there for Nellie. It seemed to Maggie that her daughter loved to lie there and watch the sun bunnies playing in the apple leaves. She hummed softly in her own language, and then she would fall asleep and sleep soundly. Whatever sounds came from the road, the clever dog Archie, who knew not to bark now, sat nearby and just breathed noisily. There, too, at arm's length, stood a small, elegant garden table and 2 armchairs. Grandfather and Maggie had been sitting there for a month, since the middle of May, at 12 o'clock, rocking Nellie and listening to her hum. She's going to have a beautiful voice, Grandpa laughed in a whisper, raising his index finger to the sky. And not for nothing did she go to the opera and operetta. When in October in the city and in nature became somehow, especially Petersburg, without shelter and dreary, Grandpa Greg came up with an entertainment for Maggie. These are the theaters you like, he asked. Maggie didn't know which one she liked, or if she liked them at all. I've never been to one before, she said shyly. In our town there was nothing but the House of Culture. And here I didn't have time. Sometimes they brought some performances to the House of Culture, but I was never particularly interested in it. I see. What would be interesting? did not lag behind grandfather. I like music, Maggie admitted. Not electronic music for disco, but beautiful music, which is good for thinking or remembering something. And Grandpa took a season ticket to the Mariinsky Theater, and he so mesmerized Maggie that grandfather gladly renamed it for himself in the Mariinsky, and she felt the baby's movements there for the first time. The ultrasound showed it was a girl. Maggie knew for sure. A girl listens to music, swoons along with it during opera arias and dances to the front. Can you tell I'm making this up? Maggie used to say to her grandfather, but Nellie liked Queen of Spades best of all. He looked strangely and was silent for about 5 minutes, as if he were talking to himself, but he couldn't say it aloud. He only glared. Maggie realized only then that she had not told him how she had decided to name her girl at once, as she had already called her. Nellie was born in February, on a windy, blizzardy night. Balloons and flowers greeted them from the maternity hospital by 3 people: Grandpa, Vivian, and Kieran. Kieran drove them home, and it wasn't until their friends had left after a small buffet that Grandpa Greg sat down across from Maggie and asked, "Maybe you should let Nellie's father know she was born after all? What do you think?" "Grandpa, you haven't asked anything about him at all for so long. I thought you never would. You don't want to know anything about him?" "I just saw that you didn't want to talk about him. It's a day like this. Maybe you'll see things differently now." "The trouble with people like you is that you judge others by your own judgment," said Maggie. "You're right in some ways, but don't forget that I'm old. I've learned a few things and gotten over my naivete. Just bring me up to speed, at least briefly, while our girl is asleep." And Maggie did. To her immortal surprise, it was not at all hard for her to tell her grandfather about Archie and how easily he'd walked away from her, as if retelling a movie or a novel. It didn't have the slightest relevance to her anymore. She has a different life with other people in charge. Grandpa agreed with Maggie. Everyone who should know about Nellie's birth had already been notified. It turned out that it only seemed to Maggie that the recent past had evaporated completely. Vivian tiptoed over, looked at the sleeping Nellie, and said, sitting down on the edge of the chair, "Maggie, you'll have to forgive me in advance, please. I'm a fool to admit it." "Don't scare me with your preambles," Maggie said. She had almost no doubts about what she was going to talk about. "We had a big corporate retreat at work, the company's 20th anniversary. Shashliks in the evening scattered on the bumps to talk. Well, we have a purely female company gathered on the open veranda of all ages from 30 to 55, and there was the usual conversation about how hard it is to raise a child alone, that say it is better not to dare. In general, it's always poverty and problems. And somehow everyone fell into such pessimism, strange for a corporate party, that I wanted to tell something good. I mean, it's not always that bad. So I told Maggie the story of how she found her grandfather. I didn't even give her name, but I told them she was my friend. The girls were surprised, happy for her and her daughter, and cheered up. You'd think that would be the end of it. No way. A day later, Sunday, the doorbell rings. Maggie's ex is on the doorstep, looking anxiously for her. I let him in. Of course, I'm not being rude. Or rather, I was just confused by surprise and forgot I should have been harsh. "This is a phenomenon," I said. Here he began to me, obviously according to the prepared scenario, say, he realizes that I consider him a scoundrel, and he fully agrees. He is a scoundrel, but only now he has realized everything, and other things in the same vein. Probably watched a couple shows as a guide. I sit there nodding, pretending to be touched by his remorse, and he sings to me that he would have apologized to Maggie a long time ago if she hadn't changed her phone number and location. I lost track of her, you see. "I've only just decided to ask you now. I was so ashamed to show up," he said. I was even too lazy to ask him tricky questions. I was so disgusted. He thinks I'm a fool. No, I do not claim to be a smart woman, but not to this extent. I don't know how to get rid of him. As luck would have it, Kieran was out fishing with Eugene. If only it were that easy. Archie started begging me. "Give me an address, at least give me a phone number." So I blurted it out. "I've got my own life and my own business. I don't have time to deal with other people's problems. We haven't talked to each other since we moved away. We were just roommates. Maybe Maggie even went home. Go back to your town if that's what you want. He didn't believe me for a second. Don't lie to me, kid. I ain't done nothing wrong to you, he started. He's angry and about to threaten me, even though it's not good for him. I was lucky the fishing trip didn't work out and Kieran came home early. So Kieran kicked him out, talked to him in the street once, made him promise not to come to us. Vivian paused, took a big sip of her cooled coffee, stroked Olaf's arm, and without waiting for Maggie to comment, continued. I'm just convinced I was convinced from the beginning that his appearance had something to do with my chatter. And he heard about you at the corporate party, that you're doing well, so he decided to try his luck and get a big piece of the action. It seems like a big city, but in such cases you realize that Cocoran is small. It turns out that someone always sees something, hears something, and passes it on to the wrong person. And I'm an accountant. I'm close to the personnel department. I'm friends with our personnel officer, Bella. I told her the situation, asked her to look in the profiles where the husbands of those girls who were sitting with us in the company, and listened to my story. We got in, looked, it didn't take long. Only 7 girls were married. And my hunch was right. Kathy in sales has Omega Lux service on her husband's profile, just like your Archie. You said the name, and I remember things like that. Remember when we were laughing? Why is there a C in Omega Luxury? And then it turned out that it's a designation of the Viboard district, and there are other Omegas. Here is the most likely version. That Archie is a buddy of Kathy's husband, and she told the story from the corporate party in front of him. And this goose, of course, recognized himself and you. It's too much of a match. Didn't I mention you were my roommate the other day? Maggie, I'm sorry, and be aware that he might show up, Vivian warned. Wow, Vivian, you're really something. Maggie smiled, trying to make her smile as serene as possible. You've made such a detective out of nothing, even going into the personnel records. It's not your fault. You couldn't have foreseen anything, you just told me in the mood. I've always loved hearing other girls' stories, too. I didn't think there was anything wrong with it. If you're not gossiping, not saying mean things behind your back, but just talking about a person, thank you for not being mad at me. I would understand if you scolded me. Are you going to do anything about it? What do you mean? Maggie didn't understand. Stuff my stuff in a suitcase and run off somewhere? No one came to see me. Even if Archie somehow found out where I lived, there was no way he'd come here. Unless you said it was a threesome. Maybe he's picturing a mansion with columns, an alarm system, a panic button, and a couple of grim bodyguards. I didn't mention that, Vivian exhaled with relief. Oh, I even said that you have a gorgeous dog, a South Russian sheepdog. By the way, this breed is considered unpredictable and aggressive. Sorry, Olaf. By the way, you do have an alarm system, don't you? Richard returned home lively, happy to see old friends. He joked, retold stories of his classmates, sent greetings from them to his granddaughter and great-granddaughter, and announced that he had missed them. Maggie didn't tell him about Vivian's accident. It wasn't right to worry if he was the only one who would worry about her and Sarah. He needed to be taken care of, too, and there was no one else to do that but her. Sure, she was scared at first, but only a little, and at the very first moment. It's clear that Archie is not a villain, but an ordinary selfish guy. Absolutely nothing to be afraid of. Maggie will think of something if he shows up. A month later, Maggie had almost forgotten Vivian's warning. She had no time to think about unpleasant things. Her daughter Sarah was growing up. She was already sitting up in her crib, trying to sit up even in the soft cocoon chair. When she saw Olaf, she was happy and stretched her arms to him, trying to run them into his shaggy hair. Don't worry, Richard said reassuringly. Olaf understands perfectly well that it's a puppy. Vivian came almost every weekend with her granddaughter and sometimes with Kieran. But Maggie also wanted to suddenly go to Peter. Grandpa was supportive. And I still wonder how you are still not bored. At your age, solitude is usually hard to bear. The baby's over 6 months old. It's time you got out into the world. Go out with Vivian, even if it's just a carefree summer cafe. And Mommy needs to rest too. Why don't you find the milk and I'll do it without you? Fine, and feed. Good girl, praised Richard. I am amazed at your knowledge in different areas. What did you think? I secretly read literature about children and control the process of growing and education. Grandpa grinned. So Maggie went to Vivian's. They did not sit in an outdoor cafe and walk together through the zoo, but still had a great time. They said they'd be coming here with Sarah very soon, showing her bigger animals than Olaf. She'd definitely be interested. They talked about how, when Sarah gets a little older, Maggie is going to open a little beauty parlor. Grandpa wants to help her start a business she likes, and it would just be great if Vivian would agree to do the bookkeeping. They did 3 laps around the zoo. Olaf didn't want to leave. When we managed to get him out, we bought ice cream and sat down with him on a bench in Alexander Park. Maggie took a bite of ice cream with pleasure and heard a half-forgotten familiar voice from the side. Maggie Schenk. She shuddered. It seemed to her that Vivian had, too. Olaf was running around the flower bed, eating ice cream on the run. Archie stepped out of the mottled shade of a tree and stood in front of them. Maggie Schenk. Hello, Maggie, he said to her. We have to go, Vivian said. We're late, let's go. Wait for me just a little while, Maggie heard her own carefree voice. I'm interested. It won't take long. I'm listening. The last words were meant for Archie. Where's our daughter? He asked, making a worried face. We don't have anything ours, Maggie Reshetniak explained amicably. I'm sorry if you can. I need you and your daughter. It just took me a long time to realize it. I'd do anything for you. If you'll let me try to start over. Vivian told you I was looking for you. Olaf ran around the flower bed, eating ice cream on the run. Archie stepped out of the mottled shade of a tree and stood in front of them. Maria Schenk. Hello, Marina, he said to her. We have to go, Vivian rushed over. We're late, let's go. Wait for me literally just a little bit. Maggie heard her own carefree voice. I'm interested. It won't take long. I'm listening. The last words were meant for Archie. Where's our daughter? He asked, making a worried face. We don't have anything ours, Maggie Reshetniak explained amicably. I'm sorry, if you can. I need you and your daughter. It just took me a long time to realize it. I'd do anything for you. If you'll let me try to start over. Vivian told you I was looking for you. Vivian stood aside by the flower bed, listened. Olaf didn't even pull her back, jumping around. Maggie grinned slightly, wrinkled her nose. Very, very theatrical. I have nothing to forgive you. It's been and gone. Then it had to be. Thanks for the daughter. She's beautiful. How did it happen? Deep, said Archie with reproach and admiration at the same time. You look just Hollywood something else. Or it's really time for different. I don't hold a grudge against you, Archie. And I'm not filing for alimony. Don't worry. You'll keep all your savings, Maggie continued in the same peaceful tone. Maggie, don't do this to me. You can't have forgotten everything so quickly. I know you. It wouldn't have been you. People don't change that fast. And we have a daughter, and you won't even let me look at her. I know you found your grandfather, but that's not the father. I'm not giving up until you give me a chance. Now he's going to play the macho man who decided to fight for his love. Maggie rose from the bench, walked slowly around Archie, stroked his shoulder lightly, made sure he took it as a good sign, and said in the same secure, peaceful and calm voice, people change. That's how quickly people change when circumstances force them to. I know you're aware of my financial changes, so you're under no illusions. I'm glad I wasn't married to you at the time of my grandfather's arrival. You can find a much better option with an inheritance, even with a child. One more piece of advice. If you decide to look for me or my daughter, in any way to let me know about myself, you know who, what, and how in the 90s earned a living, with whom you had to communicate. My grandfather, and now I have the appropriate connections. My grandfather owes a lot to the influential Mr. Smith, if that name means anything to you. A man like that doesn't withdraw his protection for no reason. They can always be called upon to get rid of unwanted nuisances like you, Archie. It's nothing personal, but consider it a sign of forgiveness. Maggie breathed angrily into his ear and staggered back just in case. She turned and walked across the lawn toward the zoo. Now it's going to disappear from the horizon, Vivian said. Listen, I didn't expect this from you. You've really changed, haven't you? I felt that I wasn't alone in the world and I changed. I can see that. Maggie. Who's Smith? You never told me about him. Is he the guy your grandfather invented the production lines for? I don't even know his name. Let's go with Jock. Jock Smith is a vaudeville authority figure for Archie, okay? You just made him up. Passers-by turned around, some irritated, but most smiled. What fun and infectious laughter from those young beautiful girls and the baby. You're covered in ice cream. Up to your ears, running around them so contentedly. Kieran came to pick them up as arranged. Oh, barely made it through the traffic, he exhaled. Some uncle jumped up to Eugene and me while we were fishing and began to claim that we had taken his permanent seat. So we squeezed the chair. There's his holy tire, there's his holy tire, there's his rotten rod stands, there's his driftwood. It's the first time in my life, Kieran continued. And you know me, if he'd asked nicely, we'd have left. Even after the rudeness, I said to him, look, you buy this place from the city on the copies, and the reservoir will be yours. In the meantime, behave yourself. You'll be better off with decent people. But you're like Jock Smith's favorite, said Vivian. You already have acquaintances I don't know. That's not my Maggie. Kieran replied that they were giggling for nothing. There's nothing to be amused about. I'll bring Maggie home and tell my grandfather that she has strange acquaintances, ostentatious macho men about whom nothing is known in the house. I've got to be serious and think more about my kids. Rich mother-in-law came to check on her daughter-in-law in the hospital, and upon hearing her words, Maggie McCullough was not happy with her son's choice. Camel, of course, is a grown man, studying, earning money, lives separately, however, in the apartment, inherited by Maggie McCullough, inherited from his mother. But still the woman, taking the photo of her son from the dresser, involuntarily sighed. In the photo, Camel was captured on the day of graduation from school. Cheerful, handsome, statuesque. And how does his suit fit? Oh, it's a sight to behold. Maggie McCullough had the jacket and pants specially ordered in advance from an expensive attire. She wanted Camel to shine at the prom. Well, one of the best students of a prestigious grammar school, and should look accordingly. How the girls looked up to Camel. A mother's heart sang with pride. And Camel was not shy of female society, behaved with girls relaxed, free, not like most of his peers. Camel was always the soul of the company. In childhood, this boy had to be constantly watched with a kind of boiling nature, and not far from trouble. Going everywhere, seeking and finding adventures, and how Maggie trembled over her only child, how she tried to secure the apartment. And still at the age of 3, the boy managed to stick a pizza into the socket, how he was shocked then. His delicate hands were instantly covered with burns. It's a miracle he didn't die. Maggie McCullough cried while waiting for the ambulance, cradled her tearing son, and did not even realize that this is still flowers. Camel subsequently fell many times, either from a tree or from a fence. Once even got a concussion, and dogs bit him in the yard, and on a bicycle he got into an accident. I can't think of everything. He's a good-looking kid. And all because Camel was bored just sitting at home. He was drawn to the outdoors, to friends and adventure. Who did he turn out to be? Maggie McCullough herself has always been a model girl, obeyed her parents, afraid to upset or frighten them. And she chose a spouse to match. Stephen, Camel's father, never had a violent temper either. And Camel, that's what Camel is to them. But Maggie McCullough was proud of her son's bright personality. He always had so many friends, so many admirers. Not some gray mouse, but the man of the house and the soul of the company. From his earliest childhood, Maggie knew that her son was better and smarter than the others. I mean, he could read at the age of 3. And neither mother nor father did not make any special efforts to teach the kid. He figured it out on his own. Camel asked questions, what is written here? What is this letter? And little by little, he learned. Maggie McCullough and Stephen were shocked when their 3-year-old read a sign on a store one day. It came as a surprise. Maybe he just memorized it, questioned the father, eyeing the wee one suspiciously. The parents immediately checked their hunch. But no, little Camel confidently read the names of stops and inscriptions on billboards. A little later, Camel learned to count, and again by himself. It was just the boy's nature, curious, greedy for everything new. Sometimes it turned into dangerous adventures, and sometimes such academic success. Maggie McCullough was incredibly pleased with the child's abilities to the first grade. It became clear that Camel has nothing to do in a regular school. The woman made every effort, but still got her son into the most prestigious lyceum in their city. She had to pay someone. But that's okay. Their family was already quite wealthy. When Maggie married Stephen, he was a poor student. But the girl never dreamed of being rich. She herself came from a more than modest family, lived with her mother and father in a one-room apartment, worked after graduating from technical school as an accountant at the factory. There was a period when all her friends started to get married one by one. One would invite the other to the wedding, then the other. And Maggie was all alone, even though she had quite a nice appearance. I guess she was too strict back then. And modest. So guys preferred to get acquainted with more simple and cheerful girls. From the outside, it seemed that Maggie was quite comfortable alone, but she wasn't. And then there's Stephen. They met at a dance at his university. He approached Maggie only at the end of the evening, and blushing and embarrassed, asked her to dance. At first glance, the girl did not like the stubby guy, but she agreed. So already too long at the wall alone stood. During the dance they talked, got to know each other better, and when the music stopped, Maggie looked at her beau with completely different eyes. Smart, polite, kind, reliable, focused on her studies and career. Maggie even then felt that with such a man will not be lost, and her intuition didn't fail her. They started dating. A year later, Stephen proposed to Maggie. He was still studying at the university at that time, and at the same time worked part-time as an assistant engineer in a construction company. The girl thought and agreed. What's the drag? All her friends were already married. She liked Stephen. Her parents didn't mind. Her mom, on the contrary, was even happier. Her daughter was finally settled. And the son-in-law suited them just fine. A well-mannered and respectful future engineer. As a married couple, the university provided them with a dormitory. A small room, only one bathroom on the whole floor, a shared kitchen. But in a strange way, Maggie even liked this life. She was learning to be a wife and a mistress. She felt like an adult. And Stephen was there for her, reliable, loving. With him, the young wife felt beautiful and charming. He won her compliments, bought her wife some inexpensive gifts. There was simply not enough money for something more serious. Scholarships, salaries, part-time workers, no room to spread out. And then Stephen graduated from university, got a full-time job in the construction bureau, where he worked part-time as a student. The young specialist was immediately noticed and started to be promoted. Career growth had a positive effect on his salary. Soon the couple were able to move into their own apartment. Stephen's work helped him with its purchase. It's a pity we didn't have time to have a child. Stephen jokingly lamented. Then we would have gotten a two-bedroom. And indeed sad. Unlike her husband, Maggie was seriously upset. Don't worry about it, Stephen put his arm around her shoulders. We'll still have everything and children, and a big apartment. Wait a little. And Stephen kept his promise. Indeed, very soon he learned to provide for their little family fully. And Maggie had never lived so well, even at her parents' house. Now she could buy herself beautiful dresses and shoes in the stores that she had previously avoided because they were so expensive. But they were great. And the couple often dined in restaurants and flew to the sea for vacation. At least once a year they even got their own car. Stephen was already the boss, and the company was actively developing and profits were growing. The persistent, promising specialist was not offended by money. He was valued and respected at work. Happiness overshadowed one thing: no way to get a young child. Stephen did not despair, said, what are years, everything will still be. We are young, healthy, why worry? But Maggie was still worried. Her friends' children had already gone to kindergarten, and some of them to school. And she, Maggie, pretended that everything suited her. On tactless questions of relatives and friends, answered that they are not yet planning heirs. But the young woman's heart was troubled and aching, and so wanted to become a mom. She and Stephen could give a lot to the baby: a separate room, toys, clothes, entertainment, and most importantly, love and care. It was a shame it had to be like this. The doctors were throwing up their hands. It seems that both spouses were quite healthy. Well, medicine was not as well developed then as it is now. Maggie secretly went to her grandmother's witch doctor. The woman found out about her at work. One of her colleagues assured that her relative was able to become a mother after visiting this old woman. She is a magician, just works miracles, cures everything in the world. They say she can even cure the hopeless. What about you? Of course, Maggie asked for the healer's address. She said her cousin needed to get her baby's warts out, but the woman went to the healer with a very different request. The dark spring smell of dried herbs and wax in the house. A thin old woman with attentive black eyes. "I see your misfortune," the landlady said from the doorstep. "You can't have a baby. But there's no problem. There's no work for me here." "What do you mean?" Maggie, who thought she was suffering from some serious illness, was surprised. She couldn't get pregnant. "It happens," the old woman sounded just like Stephen. "Wait, it'll happen." Maggie wasn't ready to hear that. She had traveled almost 2 hours to this village in the hope of getting a cure. The young woman told the old woman about it, almost crying. "Oh, young people," grinned the witch doctor. "All right, here is a dry herb, make tea from it, and drink it every day on an empty stomach for 2 weeks. "Thank you." Maggie was happy. Now she had the cure in her hands, so she hadn't come to this wilderness for nothing. Indeed, only a month after that visit, Maggie realized that she was expecting a child. The joy of the young couple was unprecedented. The woman didn't know what to think. Did the magic tea really help, or did everything happen by itself? But it was unimportant. The main thing was that they would have a baby. Like most women, Maggie McCullough dreamed of a daughter, a little obedient doll, which you can braid pigtails, and which is so nice to dress up in beautiful dresses. But Camel was born a sturdy, screaming baby. The baby is demanding and very active. For the first time seeing the baby, Maggie realized here he is, the main person in her life. She will do everything to make this baby was happy. Stephen at that time almost did not appear at home. He was starting his own business, a very risky step, but the man went for it. And his wife supported him. She was always on the side of her husband and trusted him in all important matters. Quiet and unremarkable young man turned out to be smart, persistent, grasping. He perfectly saw the possibilities and knew what he wanted. Maggie had no doubt her husband will succeed, sooner or later. She would help him in any way she could. It was for their future. And for her son, Camel, too. Stephen could not physically help his wife with the baby, though he wanted to. But the man would come home when the baby was asleep. And sometimes Maggie did too. Well, the woman didn't complain. Caring for the baby gave her joy. And the prospects that Stephen was painting were inspiring. Stephen's business was booming. At first it was a firm for major repairs of buildings, then they engaged in construction. Small scale at first, homestead plots and private houses. Then it got bigger. Stephen managed to enter the big business of building residential high-rise buildings in their city. It was a whole different kind of income. Maggie was even dizzy with how much their lives had changed. They weren't complaining about poverty. As head of the department, Stephen earned quite enough. But after becoming the owner of the company, the man really got rich. The family moved into a beautiful country house with a swimming pool. They had a substantial bank account. Stephen suggested that Maggie quit her job, but she herself did not want to. She worked as chief accountant for her husband's company. She liked to realize that she controlled the financial flows and helped her husband in his business. Everything was just fine. Camel grew up, pleased his parents with successes in studies and sports. The business was developing, bringing profit. The relationship between the spouses was wonderful. They became for each other also partners, support, companions. And then suddenly there was a crisis. And competitors at a difficult moment hustled. So Stephen lost his company. Camel was just finishing school. The man took it hard. Maggie understood her husband. After all, the company was his brainchild, which he nurtured from infancy, made strong and prosperous. And now the company was in the hands of competitors. Maggie wasn't worried about their financial well-being. They had savings, and Stephen would not stay idle with such experience. And so it was. Her husband soon got a job in the same construction company where he had started. He was, of course, promoted to a management position. Not his own business, but it was okay. Even better, in a way calmer. The standard of living was the same. Well, the family didn't have that bank account anymore. It's just a pity, because still the lion's share of the money was spent on business development. So Maggie decided for herself that they have not lost anything and live so well. No need to complain. Meanwhile, Kamil finished school and entered Moscow State University on his own, on a budget. The guy chose the faculty of law. He was always like that, determined, self-confident, fearless. Kamil did not resemble his father. Stephen at his age was quiet, unassuming, serious. All he did was study. Kamil had everything: a gold medal, girls and friends. Active, cheerful, handsome. Maggie McCullough wondered how they could have such a guy. Perfect, just good at everything. Absolutely everything. He got into MSU on his own. People who knew him, of course, didn't believe it, thought that his father had hustled him up and gave him the money. But Kamil did it himself. He's smart. From a very young age, he amazed others with his abilities. But his mother's heart ached for her son. How will he be without them, in a foreign big city? The boy was accustomed to live in the family on everything. Maggie constantly looked after him, controlled his movements. How could she not? She's a mother. Kamil's got a bit of an adventurous streak in him. No, when he's older, he'll be calmer, of course. But for now, I have to keep an eye on him. He's a sociable boy, so don't let him get into bad company. Kamil's been drawn to fun and adventure since he was a boy. Maggie did not want to let her only son Kamil go to Moscow alone, though she realized that Moscow State University was a different level from the universities in their city. Come on, don't worry, you'll let him off the grid, Stephen exhorted. He's a smart guy, since he went to such a university on his own. And he's not a little kid. What, do you want to hold his hand till he's old? Remember me, I was even younger when I came here from the village. I went to technical school first, then the institute. I was a teenager. And I didn't disappear. Maggie sighed. Why compare Kamil and Stephen? They have very different personalities. And her husband doesn't feel and understand his son as she does her mother. That's why he doesn't worry. Yes, Kamil is old enough for his age. Maggie had no doubts about her son's intelligence. But his character, Kamil's character, was a cause for concern. Left without parental control, having broken free, Kamil could forget about his studies and get into trouble. Young, sociable, cheerful. Excessive freedom will make his head spin, and then to trouble is not far away. But Kamil still went to Moscow. Maggie was worried, calling her son every day. He cheerfully reported that everything was great. He was studying, had adapted to lead his own life, was quite happy with his life, and was very happy that he had made such a decision. Mother's heart even calmed down for a while. Things seem to be going well. Kamil is doing well. She and Stephen have done it, raised a smart, conscious son, and a handsome one at that. Now it's just a matter of getting the kid married. And that's it. We can exhale. Parental mission accomplished successfully. Once Stephen and Maggie dreamed of a large family, planning 2 or 3 children. Financially, they could afford it. But when Kamil was born, Maggie suddenly realized that she did not want to deprive her son of anything, even if they had enough money to provide a decent future for several children. Maggie realized that attention, love, care, and time devoted to Kamil alone could not be bought in any store. No, she reasoned, looking at the then still small child, let Kamil be the only one we have. It must be so painful to see your parents have a new baby and forget you. Not at all, objected Stephen, who had grown up in a large family. On the contrary, my siblings and I had fun and warmth together, but Maggie stood her ground, and Stephen didn't argue. He was busy developing his business at the time, and the issue of childbearing did not particularly bother him. And so it turned out that Kamil was the only child in the family. Maggie regretted it for the first time when her son jumped out of the nest. Who now to take care of? Who to cook delicious meals, iron shirts, knit warm socks? Stephen, as always, is all about work. And he's not particularly fond of taking care of anyone. He's not used to being taken care of. Kamil has become more distant, more mature, more autonomous. He used to call every day with news, or at least readily answered his mother's calls. Now it's okay, bye, I have to go. Conversations between mother and son rarely lasted more than a minute. And then Kamil stopped picking up the phone altogether, and communication was practically nil. Maggie missed him, worried, anxious. How was her baby boy in a big distant city? Doesn't someone hurt her son? Camel's voice sounded sad, cold, and alien. Maggie shared her fears with her husband, but he kept dismissing them. He had a checkup, or the commissioning of an object. Stephen lived to work, and he certainly did not work for money. Or rather, not only because of it. Maggie could see that Stephen liked what he was doing. But she herself, Maggie, had no such thing. So she stayed in the office from call to call and home to home. Maggie went to work just to be in the team, among her co-workers. Friends sharing life stories, discussing the news. It was her social life. You can't stay cooped up at home all day. Against the background of problems with children, which colleagues told her about, her situation was just perfect. Someone's son was expelled from university. Someone's daughter got pregnant at 16. Maggie's was perfect. Camel is a smart girl. He himself entered a prestigious university. He studies by himself and copes with household problems. Good for him. Everyone envied Maggie when she talked about her son. Of course, the woman did not share all her worries with her colleagues. They were in a relationship, after all, and Maggie wanted to look better in their eyes. She didn't tell anyone that Camel had become unsociable and withdrawn. The guy answered questions, talked to his parents, but cold called himself just to ask for money. Something was clearly going on in his life. Although Stephen brushed off his spouse's concerns, he just never felt for his son the way she felt for his mother. Leave the boy alone. Stephen was angry. That's why he won't talk to us. He's fed up with your concern. Camel went away from us on purpose to be on his own. Get out of my way. Maggie just sighed. Maybe Stephen's right about something, but Camel's not so independent. Not in every way. Of course, they were still providing for him fully. Life in the capital isn't cheap, but his parents could afford to make their student son's life as comfortable as possible. Rent for an apartment, monthly expenses not a small sum. At Camel's age, Stephen never dreamed of such a thing. As a student, he worked, while Camel could rest and study. The problem was that the boy needed more and more money. His father had set a monthly limit for him, and that amount was many times the average salary in their town. Stephen rightly thought that Camel should have enough money, but this was not the case. Camel repeatedly asked his mother to send him money. He had to pay for a seminar, or the washing machine broke down, or something else. There was always a reason. Don't tell your father, Camel asked. Maggie understood her son. The boy was a little embarrassed that his parents were still supporting him as an adult. Camel wanted to look more independent, more responsible in front of his father. Maggie transferred money from her paycheck to her son and didn't tell Stephen about it. Costin asked for it. The woman was pleased by the fact that she and her son had a secret in common. It brought them closer together. Camel had become very closed and secretive. His son was reluctant to answer questions about his life at that time. Yes, everything is normal. I study. With friends I communicate. Have a rest. Everything is good with me. And your girlfriend? Do you have a girlfriend? Mom? I'll take care of it. Okay. At first, Camel still came to his hometown for vacations. Then, around the third year, these visits stopped. All communication was reduced to infrequent and uninformative phone calls. Maggie was worried. All the more so because she was almost certain that her son was in trouble. Why else did he sound so sad, and why did he need so much money every month? Maybe we should drop in on him unexpectedly. The woman consulted with her husband. Why? He was puzzled. Why meddle in the life of a grown-up guy? You'll push him away even more. It's just a separation process, normal for guys. Don't interfere. I'm worried about him. Something's not right. Stop it. Camel's doing great. If there was a problem, we'd know about it by now. So don't panic. He's old and smart. He'll figure it out on his own. Maggie was annoyed by her husband's calmness. It was as if Stephen didn't care about his only child. Out of sight, out of mind, the husband was not interested in anything but his work. Laurel McCullough had already decided that Camel would settle in New York. Why not? He obviously liked the city. His voice was so enthusiastic at first when he first moved there. Back then, his son was still sharing his impressions with his parents. And he's a bright and promising kid. He's the kind of guy who's going to make it in New York. Oh, that's great on the one hand, but on the other hand, they'd almost stop seeing each other altogether. Laurel was upset. Her son hadn't shared his plans with her. One thing that pleased her was that Camel's aloofness and coldness seemed to have gradually disappeared. His voice sounded friendly again. The son even began to take an interest in his parents' affairs, which had not happened for a long time, but he spoke vaguely about his future, soon the diploma. And then I'll come and tell you everything. You'll be in for a surprise. The word surprise was intriguing and alarming. What was he up to, this Camel? But at least Laurel was recognizing her son again, the fun-loving adventurer. Camel had indeed arrived. Not alone, but with his fiancée. Laurel, of course, understood that her adult son had some kind of relationship. But to be so serious. A fiancé right off the bat. Vivian didn't like her future mother-in-law at first sight. A gray mouse, like a girl from the capital, dressed modestly and tastelessly. Thin hair of inexpressive gray color. Slim, even puny. How could she attract Camel's attention? He's always liked brightly colored beauties. This one was nothing to look at. Vivian had beautiful eyes and a nice, open, wide smile, but still. The closer Laurel got to know Vivian, the more she worried. It turned out that the girl came to New York from some village. She went to college, graduated with a specialty, but could not find a job and went to waitress in a bar. That's where she and Camel met. No, did you hear that? Laurel whispered indignantly when she and Stephen were alone. They had a big house. Camel's room was on another floor. The young people couldn't hear their parents talking, but Laurel still spoke in whispers. I like Vivian, though. She's a nice girl. Not like these modern ponytails. Calm down, Stephen objected. New York wasn't built from scratch. Think of me. I was a country boy, too, and then I made it on my own. That's right, all by yourself. Laurel complained. You went to university, worked your ass off, worked hard. And this one wants to move into a beautiful life on someone else's back. She saw that Camel was from a rich family and she jumped on him like a piranha. Doesn't he understand? She's nothing to look at. Or did they cast a spell on him? You're panicking again on nothing. Stephen cooled his wife. The main thing is that Camel likes Vivian. You don't have to like her. You don't have to live with her. Laurel had to agree with the last one. Camel did indeed look calm and peaceful next to Vivian. He was holding her hand gently, caring for her and wooing her. Laurel had never seen her son like this before. The girls were falling for him, he didn't have to try. But it turned out that Camel could be gallant and courteous. It's an amazing discovery. He's really changed, matured. There was a new wisdom in his gaze, a kind of independence. It seems that life does change people, makes men out of boys. Camel had already made an important decision. He had told his parents that he and Vivian would soon be married. Maybe he'll change his mind. Where would he marry? Laurel hesitated. Age is not the same, just graduated from university. Now he should think about his career, not about marriage. But even here, she did not find understanding from her husband. Well, you've got to be kidding. Stephen reminded her. When did you and I get married? I was still in school, we were even younger. I am a professional editor with a degree in philology and 20 years of experience. Here's my version of editing a text. Those were different times. Times are always the same, Stephen said. Leave the kid alone. He's grown up. He can make his own decisions. Camel and Vivian moved into Laurel McCullough's mother's apartment. The place was empty anyway. The woman didn't mind. It's better for them to live away from us, she said. It's too hard for me to play nice in front of Vivian, my son's fiancée. Laurel McCullough was annoyed by everything: the way Vivian spoke, moved, dressed, her unpleasant voice, her unattractive appearance. Well, what else to expect from a village girl shepherdess? Suddenly decided to become a princess. Laurel resented her. Vivian's stories about her family and fate were depressing, and Laurel didn't even have anything to latch on to. The girl had been born into a large family. Her childhood and youth were spent in the village, herded cows, worked in the field, in a word, a peasant with all the consequences. Vivian's intelligence obviously did not shine, but she had a lot of ambition. Otherwise, she would not have gone to New York to conquer the city. She had a mediocre education, some culinary school. She worked as a maid in a hotel, then got a job as a waitress in a bar. Laurel realized the girl's family was in dire straits. Her father had a stroke. The mother worked alone. Of all the children, Vivian was the oldest. Her younger siblings were still in school. So Vivian was the only one who could help her parents in any way. And she did, sending them almost all the money she earned. What a good girl. Stephen marveled when he heard about it. And I was thinking that Vivian had a good job, Laurel said cynically. She sends her wages to her family, and Camel keeps her. Good girl. She's gone, and she looks like a Roman girl. A wolf in sheep's clothing. The young settled in New York. They were not going to return to their hometown. Vivian now did not work at all, was engaged in the house, attended some courses. Sort of like a fitness trainer studied, as from childhood she loved physical education. I'm going to earn money, the girl said. It is my dream to train people, to make them healthy and beautiful. But Laurel understood everything. Laurel McCullough knew this breed of woman. She'd been there. They create the appearance of vigorous activity, constantly learning something to later supposedly earn. They study psychology or manicure. But in the end, they sit on their rich husbands' necks all their lives. Camel, on the other hand, quickly found a job. With his education, it's no wonder. He was hired by a local oil company as a corporate lawyer. The pay is more than good. He got an apartment. Live and enjoy. That's what young people did. They lived soul to soul. Sometimes they met with friends, occasionally went on vacation and looked quite happy. Laurel was happy that they kept quiet about the wedding. Maybe they will live and disperse, open their eyes, she thought. Camel's age is not small, and I tried to accurately convey to my son the true state of affairs. But Camel didn't like it when his mother said bad things about his fiancée. Vivian is the best person in the world, he said. She's done so much for me. You can't imagine. She's the only one who makes me feel happy. Did that lying country girl do a spell? Laurel was angry, but she couldn't help it. Camel still showed his character, his tendency to adventurism, his passion for adventure. The calm, quiet Vivian sort of balanced him out. That was good, except it still wasn't the kind of daughter-in-law Laurel dreamed of seeing. Although maybe it's too early to worry, she reassured herself. About the wedding, the young people are not yet stuttering. Then it turned out that Camel and Vivian had long been husband and wife. They signed quietly, said nothing to anyone, and lived happily ever after. Laurel found out by accident. Vivian finished her courses and got a job at the local sports club. Laurel went to the page of this institution and saw a photo of Vivian, under which their last name was displayed. Laurel called her son and demanded an explanation. Yes, Vivian and I got married. Camel didn't deny it. She took my last name. I will try to keep the text as close to the original as possible and follow your instructions. Why didn't you tell us anything? Maggie asked. Why? Smiled Camel. So as not to worry you for nothing? I can see that you haven't accepted Vivian. So we decided to get married, to make it just for the two of us. We didn't want a big celebration. After that conversation, Maggie McCullough was very upset. How? How could they do such a thing? What would she tell people now? She had dreamed of having fun at her son's wedding. From the moment she first held him in her arms, she had even thought of her own hair and makeup. And the relatives have long been interested in when the solemn event. Everyone was counting on a big celebration. And now it's such a disappointment. It's all Vivian's fault. She's a cunning country girl. She knew the groom's parents were against her. She was afraid of a confrontation, so she did it quietly. They're country folk, and from a family with many children, so they're not lacking in cunning. But Stephen was as calm as ever about his son's decision. We must respect Camel's choice, he said. He's an adult. Respect, they covered their indifference with plausible reasons. Stephen is all wise and noble, but in reality he doesn't care about Camel and his fate, as long as everything is going well at work. But there's still hope, Maggie thought. Maybe Camel will come to his senses. Even more likely, as long as it's not too late. Otherwise, that Vivian will have a baby, and that'll be the end of it. Camel will be in bondage for the next 18 years. And then there's Stephen, like a fool, honestly. When Camel and his wife come to visit, he starts talking about grandchildren. When are you going to make us happy with heirs? Vivian smiles embarrassedly, as usual, playing modest. And Camel answers frankly. When the time comes, we'll be happy. For now, Vivian wants to work, to gain experience. Then she can go on maternity leave. But at least the mother-in-law was in agreement with her daughter-in-law. Maggie was happy with Vivian's decision. It's a good thing. The longer they didn't have children, the better. It seemed to Maggie that without children it would be easier for Camel and Vivian to part, if anything. Those things were always harder with children. But there was no question of parting, although Maggie McCullough, for her part, was working hard to get her son's eyes opened as soon as possible. "Does it work honestly?" she asked. "Your wife sends all her wages to her family and lives on your money. That's not the way a family does things. We don't demand anything from you." "Mom, what are you comparing? Are you and Vivian in different situations? They don't have enough money to feed their kids. Vivian's father is still recovering from his stroke. Her mom takes care of him, works, takes care of the kids. What's not to help? Your father and I didn't fall out of the sky. We worked and labored together, and her parents lived in the countryside. They gave birth to children without thinking about the future. Who's to blame now?" "Nobody's fault," Camel answered. "They don't ask for anything. We help ourselves. Mom, I love Vivian and I want her to be happy. How can she be happy if her family is in trouble? So we're helping." It's the psychology of people. Maggie continued to grumble, the habit of living at the expense of others. That's all. And children, by the way, adopt their parents' lifestyle. Mind you, children always look like their parents. It's genetic. "And what about me?" Camel smiled. He always diffused the tense atmosphere with jokes. "How did you get to be such an asshole? You're serious, determined. And me? What about you? You're just a very talented, bright, charismatic person. Not a jerk. If you were a slacker, you'd have dropped out of university, not finished your studies, and generally lived like a major on your parents' money. And you've accomplished so much." Dickhead Camel jokingly hung his head. Camel had mentioned more than once that if it hadn't been for Vivian, he didn't know what would have happened to him. But what exactly had happened, Maggie McCullough did not know. Her son didn't want to tell her, and it was useless to pry into his soul. He would immediately close himself off. But Maggie suspected that Vivian simply set up some situation, took advantage of the troubles in Camel's life, and maybe even directed them herself, and then acted as a savior. She would do it. She was a very strong and cunning opponent. Camel shut down talk of his wife at the drop of a hat. He was clearly under her influence. But this can't go on indefinitely, thought Maggie. Camel's intellect has been a great asset since he was a child. One day the hormones will subside and he will realize everything. And I'll be there when he does. I'll support him, help him if necessary. Several years have passed, but nothing in the relationship between son and daughter-in-law has not changed. On the contrary, it seems that they even began to plan a child. At least a colleague told Maggie that she saw Vivian in the Center for Reproductive Health. She has nothing to do there but to prepare for pregnancy. Maybe she's already expecting a baby. I mean, they're secretive. They don't talk about themselves. They live apart, come to visit occasionally. Things were not going the way Maggie McCullough had planned or dreamed. But otherwise, everything was fine. Her husband was still working. "Are you going on a well-deserved vacation, Maggie?" "I've had enough work. You can rest now," they told her. Camel's work was going better than ever. He, like his father, had even started to build his own business. However, he was in no hurry to leave his position. It was still unclear whether the business would work or not. Kostya is such a risk-taker, Maggie thought. Responsibility is not afraid of responsibility. Character. Only he should be an entrepreneur, a real business shark. This guy will definitely achieve a lot. And Maggie was proud of her son and loved him with all her heart. Maggie was proud of her son's success in his career, but she was concerned about his personal life. If we could just get Camel's personal life in order, it would be a thing of beauty, she thought. Vivian worked at a fitness center, earning a pittance and sending it to her family. "That's a good job," Maggie said wryly. Now she's worried about her offspring. I suppose she's determined to get Camel on her side. He still looks at her with affection and adoration. He won't wise up. That night, there was no sign of trouble. Maggie's husband, Stephen, was late for work, which was not uncommon. He was in the middle of a big inspection from Moscow. He literally slept overnight in the office, laying out the couch in his office, and going to sleep there so he wouldn't have to waste time traveling in the morning. How many times Maggie had called him for a well-deserved vacation, begged him to leave. They lived in a big house, had a bank account, and investment deposits that were steadily earning interest. Live and be happy. Maybe you should start traveling? It's great to enjoy the fruits of your own labor all your life. It's time to work hard and honorable to know, but that wasn't Stephen. It was important for him to be involved in all this reports, estimates, new objects. Maggie understood her husband and felt sorry for him. She was afraid that he might not have a heart attack or a stroke. At an advanced age, such workaholism is not always a good thing. Maggie was home alone. She watched a TV show, read a book, talked to a friend, complained to her about her poor daughter-in-law, and willful young people. I just pressed the hang-up button. But the call came again. An unfamiliar number popped up on the screen. Strangers don't call at this late hour. Hello, came a cheerful, too formal male voice in the receiver. Petrov Konstantin Stepanovich, who do you know? This is my son, Maggie said with cold horror. Her heart was clenched by the icy hand of anxiety for Kamil. What had happened? Had he been in an accident? Had he gotten drunk behind the wheel? Was he coming back from some party? Maggie gasped. It was just like Kamil. Despite his great intelligence and ability, he often behaved carelessly, like a teenager. His son might as well have gotten behind the wheel a little tipsy, even though both parents had taught him safety rules from childhood. But Kamil is Kamil, that's all there is to it. He always had an adventurous spirit and ignored many rules. How is he? Is he alive? Maggie's heart was pounding in her chest so hard it felt like it was about to burst out. Alive. He suffered minor injuries. He's being treated by paramedics right now. But his wife is much more seriously injured, came a voice in the phone. You're her mother-in-law. We need someone to come to the hospital, bring documents, the girl to answer the doctor's questions. We got through to her parents, but they live far away. Sure, Maggie replied immediately, frantically thinking about how to get into Kamil and his wife's apartment. The papers were still in there somewhere. They'd have to find the keys. The main thing was that Kamil was alive and relatively healthy. Vivian was a worry. It looked like she'd been badly hurt. Maggie dreamed of her son divorcing his wife. But that was not the fate she wanted for her daughter-in-law. Finally, Maggie found the keys to her mother's apartment where the young couple lived. She called a cab. It was only then that she realized she hadn't told her husband Stephen about the accident. She decided not to disturb him so late. She would tell him later, when the situation was clearer. The rest of the problems would be dealt with as they came up. It was the first time Maggie had been alone in her son and his wife's apartment. In the past, they'd only come here on holidays, birthdays, New Year's Eve. Her daughter-in-law always set a beautiful table. Maggie had to admit that Kamil's wife was a wonderful hostess. Yes, Vivian was indeed a good hostess. Not a speck of dust in the rooms, everything in its place. Maggie went into the young couple's bedroom and, overcome by a sudden embarrassment, opened the sturdy closet. Still, it was a little awkward being in someone else's apartment. So what could a person need in a hospital? A nightgown, pajamas, towels, Maggie thought frantically, gathering a bag for her daughter-in-law. A folder of Vivian's papers was also found here in the closet. Thoughts were churning in her head, overshadowing each other, making it hard to concentrate. Kamil was the culprit of the accident. He wasn't hurt. But with his wife, I wonder if it's as serious as the policeman said. Maybe he exaggerated? And if on the contrary softened the blow, if Kamil is now seriously injured? Maggie finally packed her things and called a cab. It was late. The cabbie sped down the deserted streets to the hospital. In the lobby, she saw her son at once. He was sitting on a bench, bandaged to the shoulders, pale but alive. Mom, it's my fault. Kamil hugged her tightly. It's my fault that Vivian is on the operating table right now. Her head is all smashed up. The doctors say there's almost no chance. If anything happens to her, I won't live. I'm telling you that for sure. Well, take it easy, Maggie exhorted her son. It might still be all right. Vivian is healthy. Her body is strong. Besides, you're both to blame. Not just you. Why did she get in the car with you drunk? She's responsible too. What are you saying? Camel pulled away and looked at his mother with wide open eyes. It's my fault, just me. There is no forgiveness for me. Only if she survives, or else I will follow her and leave. Just then a uniformed man approached. Camel, you've been treated. You can go home. Now we have to drive to the police station to give a statement. I'm coming with you, Maggie thought back. She was scared for her son. Yes, physically he was hardly hurt, but his morale left a lot to be desired. And now they were taking him to the station. It was unlikely that the police would spare the feelings of the perpetrator of the accident. It's unnecessary, replied the policeman firmly. There's nothing for outsiders to do there. Kemal left, and an anxious Maggie McCullough began to look for a doctor to find out something about her daughter-in-law's condition. No matter how the woman felt about Vivian, she felt genuinely sorry for the girl. And the once unfriendly mother-in-law prayed fervently, asking that Vivian survive. After all, otherwise Camel, so impulsive and emotional, in the heat of the moment can do something stupid. Vivian's doctor was in surgery at that moment. A whole team was fighting for the girl's life. The orderly, who already knew the situation, took Maggie for a relative of the victim and generously shared the details. Well, that her, this poor girl, drunk behind the wheel, sat down. They say he flew under 200 kilometers per hour and flew straight into the pole. He took himself out from under the impact. His instincts worked. The passenger seat took the brunt of the impact. And the girl's dead. He killed her, you goddamn freak. Maggie felt a twinge of anger at her son, but she must get used to it. Camel was indeed to blame. Who knows, the nurse continued. There's a 50-50 chance of that. I've worked here for a long time. I've seen it many times. Miracles happen. The hopeless survive and recover. And vice versa also happens. Everything seems to be fine, and a person goes away. Just you wait. The operation will be over. Luke Swan will come out to you. The operation took a long time. Maggie had time to call her husband Stephen and tell him everything. He rushed over. It was calmer waiting together. Anxiety and fear split in half. But Maggie McCullough soon asked her husband to go to the station. Camel was all alone there, in an unknown state. There was no telling what might happen to him. Her husband nodded and left. Maggie was alone again. At last a tired and angry doctor came out to her. Are you a relative of Vivian's? He asked. Maggie scrutinized his face, trying to understand what news this man was bringing. She nodded. Well, we did the best we could. The girl survived the surgery. Now everything depends on her body. If she survives the 3 days of crisis, she'll live, but it will take a long time to recover. But there are no guarantees. Isn't there anything we can do to improve her chances? We have nothing. We've utilized every resource we have, but we're not New York. We don't have the equipment, the drugs. We can get anything, any money, you just say the word. We don't need anything yet. All we need is patience. And the agonizing days of waiting began. Maggie McCullough shuddered at every phone call. What if it's from the hospital? Camel was under investigation. The outcome of the case depended on Vivian's survival. He could not stay in the apartment. Everything there reminded him of his wife. So he lived under the care of his parents in their house. The young man didn't eat, didn't drink, and didn't even seem to sleep. He was hunched over, pale and gaunt. Camel was silent, but his mother Laurel saw that her son was tormenting himself, blaming himself for what had happened, cursing, scolding him with the last words. Of course, all this is fair, but it was very painful for Laurel to look at her child in such a state. She could not find words to comfort him. He didn't see or hear anyone at all. The only thing keeping him in this world seemed to be the possibility that he might be of use to Vivian when she came to her senses. She'd need help, rehabilitation, and Maggie was telling her son that he had to be in shape when Vivian woke up. They'd need money and strength to get her back on her feet. But Maggie herself wasn't sure her daughter-in-law would make it. Every day she called the hospital more than once to check on Vivian's condition. There was no good news. The girl was having periodic seizures. Her life was hanging by a thread. Finally, the crisis period passed. Vivian was still alive, but she did not regain consciousness. The girl was in a coma. But we can't do anything about it, the doctor said. We don't know how long such a state can last. Maybe the girl will not come out of the coma at all. But we have to do something, right? We keep her alive. We're working with proven schemes. We don't have a lot of resources here in the region. We're a long way from modern medicine. So why don't we move her somewhere else? LA. To get her some help. We could try. But there's no guarantees, and it's not a cheap endeavor. We're not poor, we'll find the money. I doubt it, the doctor shook his head. The sum is simply cosmic. One transportation of a person in this condition will cost as much as an apartment in the center of our city. Maggie had asked for an estimate, though. Luke Swan nodded his head in agreement. It'll be ready by tonight. You'll be hired. Until evening, Maggie lived in hope. The doctor said there was a chance. She would do anything to make her son happy so that he could move on with his life in peace. Who would have thought a month ago that Maggie would work so hard for her daughter-in-law? On the other hand, it's a shame for the girl. Too bad it's true. But it was because of Camel that Maggie was digging her hoof into the ground. Her heart chilled at the thought that her son might do something to himself. The amount of money Maggie had been told that evening was simply prohibitive. Yes, they were not beggars, but they were not multimillionaires either. And the bill was exactly $1 million, an unaffordable amount for their family. Even if you sell all the property and empty the bank account. Hope flickered in the morning, but faded in the evening. Maggie sank helplessly into her chair, clutching her head with her hands. What was to be done? Camel strode past like a ghost. His cheeks were sunken, his skin a sickly, pale yellow color. Guilt was eating the boy from the inside out. Should I tell him about the money? What was the point? Where would he get it? No, that would give Camel another reason to kill himself. He can't even get the money to pay for his sweetheart's treatment. The next day, Maggie went to the hospital as usual. She was sometimes allowed into the intensive care ward, where Vivian was lying. The woman did not tell her son about these visits. He will definitely want to see his wife. But Vivian was in such a state that the sight would only bring down Camel, who was barely hanging on. The once vibrant girl has become a pale mummy. Her thin arms are tied together with IVs over the blanket. Wires from a multitude of monitors and apparatuses are stretched to her chest, keeping her withered body alive. His head is tightly bandaged. There are bruises under his closed eyes. If Camel saw what he'd done to his wife, he'd feel worse. Maggie spared her son's feelings and asked the staff to keep him away from his wife. Even money had to be given to a few people to be sure. Vivian would occasionally mumble something in her sleep. Maggie listened but couldn't make out anything. But more often than not, the girl lay quiet and still. If it were not for the heaving of her chest, one would have thought that she was no longer in the world. A sharp pity clutched Maggie's heart every time she saw her sister-in-law. The woman now wondered why she had disliked her so much. Friendly, helpful, industrious. And Kamel loves her. She should have made friends with her, found a common language. Poor girl, the daughter of parents with many children, who don't care about their eldest daughter. Vivian's mother came only once. It's understandable, no money, a sick husband, a bunch of kids. Maggie realized that Vivian's mother had no time to sit by her eldest daughter's bedside in the hospital. And there's no point, really. She once saw a program where people who came out of coma, claiming as if being in a helpless state, heard and felt what was happening around them. So her mother-in-law often apologized to Vivian. She also told her how Camel was suffering and how they were all waiting for her recovery. Everything will be different now, Maggie promised. We'll live soul to soul as a family, supporting each other. Just get well soon. In case you hear something, let you know that everyone is waiting for you very much. Vivian was suddenly worried. Maggie was not surprised. It had happened many times before. The girl mumbled something again. Her mother-in-law leaned over to her face to try to make out the words. Maybe it would be possible to understand what kind of dream the girl was having. Anton Claridge. Anton Claridge? Maggie asked. It was the first time Vivian had ever said something so clearly. Maybe the girl was coming out of her coma. Anton. Would he help? Maggie rushed to fetch the doctors. Little did Vivian speak, perhaps it was a good sign. But Dr. Swan, who approached the patient, shook his head negatively after looking at the readings. No, she's still in a coma. The instruments register a brief return of consciousness. It happens occasionally, but unfortunately it doesn't mean much. The girl is stable, but no improvement is imminent, and it is no longer likely that a miracle will happen. Time is running out, and time in her situation means a lot. Maggie returned home at that time in frustration. Anton Claridge, it was a name the woman remembered well. Vivian had said he would help. Was it a coherent ramble or a request for help? She couldn't forget her sister-in-law's words. No, she would find out who Anton Claridge was by all means. He might actually be able to help the girl. But how to find him, this mysterious man? Who is he, anyway? You could ask Camel, of course, but it's better not to bother him. Camel's therapists have already started working with him. It looks like progress is being made. A careless word could undo the work of the therapists. Maggie would find out for herself. The woman decided to call Vivian's mother. Of course, she was understandably angry at Camel and accordingly at all his relatives. But what to do? If Vivian can be helped in any way, would Maggie take that step? But Vivian's mother knew nothing about Anton Claridge. She sobbed into the receiver as Maggie recounted her daughter's words. The woman even regretted making the call. She tried to spare her son's life, but she didn't even think about the feelings of the victimized girl's unhappy mother. One should be more careful from now on. After pondering, Maggie McCullough decided to use the internet. But there were so many thousands of men of all ages besides Anton Claridge. It was not easy to find the right one among them, and yet Maggie didn't give up. She studied the social pages of these men, hoping to find some connection to Vivian. Help came when she didn't expect it. One day, as usual, she went to the hospital to see her sister-in-law. Now Maggie listened with special care to her occasional words and phrases. There was little chance that she might give some clue again, but in vain. Vivian no longer said anything of the kind and generally more often lay quietly, as if in a deep sleep. That morning in the intensive care ward, Maggie saw a young woman with tearful eyes. "Who are you?" "Exactly," Maggie asked the visitor. "Why did they let you in here? Are you a relative?" "My cousin's sister," she nodded. "And you must be the mother-in-law. I was told that you come here often, worrying about Vivian, helping the staff to take care of her, buying everything she needs. You may be the mother of that bastard, but you don't have any negativity towards me. I think you raised him right. He made his own choices." "Nice to meet you," Maggie said automatically. "Oh, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Lily. I understand your situation, and I'll try to help by following directions." Vivian and I grew up together in the same village. We were very good friends, as we were related. We went to New York to pursue our dreams. Except I was more fortunate. I went to school, got a good job, and she had a life that happened to her. "So you and Vivian talked to each other a lot in New York?" Maggie McCullough asked. "Of course, we were thick as thieves. Then our paths diverged a little when we both got married, but she's still very close to me. I came to visit as soon as I could. When it happened, I was in labor and delivery. That's why I couldn't make it. Now I've finally made it." "I see. You see, Lily, I have a very strange question for you," and Maggie told her cousin Vivian about Emin Claridge. "You know, Vivian sometimes mumbles incoherent things, but she said so clearly Emin Claridge will help. I've been trying to find him, but do you know who he is?" Of course, how could I not have thought of him? He's a rock star, a very famous man. He sells out stadiums. You've heard his songs, even if you don't like rock. They're on every radio. But what does this pop star have to do with Vivian? He was head over heels in love with Vivian. Back then, Emin was just gaining popularity, but he was already a wealthy and powerful man. He dedicated songs to her. He was ready to do anything for her then, and maybe now too. But she chose Kamel. "Your Camel?" "I'm sorry, but I didn't like him even then. Careless, infantile. But you can't follow your heart." Vivian fell in love. If I were her, I wouldn't hesitate. Emin is such a talented, kind, generous man. Wow. Vivian didn't just say his name by accident, did she? Of course not. Do you know how to find him? I don't. I don't have his phone number or contacts. I see, Maggie said. So I'll find him myself, see where he's performing, and go to the concert. Then I'll get to him and tell him what happened to Vivian. Maybe that will help. Indeed, Lily looked at Maggie with admiration. You're a wonderful person. It's strange that you have such a son. I would go with you, but I have to go to the child. Thank you, baby. You've been a big help already, Maggie smiled at her. I'll be fine, don't worry. Now Maggie's goal was to find this Emin Claridge, to find and talk to him. If Vivian thought he could help, then he could. The woman had a very specific and, most importantly, achievable task before her. Could she do it? Of course she can do it. It'll be all right, Vivian. Maggie stroked her sister-in-law's thin palm. It's going to be okay. Maggie told her family she was going to Los Angeles to visit a friend. In fact, the woman had already bought a ticket to see Emin Claridge perform. He just participated in the tour and in the next few days will perform in Los Angeles. That's where Maggie would catch him, get through to him, no matter what it took. Stephen, of course, was surprised. It's strange. It's such a turbulent time. Are you going to a friend's house? What if there's something wrong with Vivian? It's a troubled time, isn't it? That's why I'm going, Maggie answered. My nerves are all shot, and I need to reset them. Laurel invites me to his place for a couple of days, says we'll walk along the waterfront, talk to each other. I need that. And if something happens to Vivian? Stephen repeated. Vivian's stable. She's in a deep coma, but her life isn't in danger yet. I talked to the doctor. Keep a better eye on Camel. Remind him from time to time that we need him. But of course Vivian will need his help soon. Stephen nodded. You're right. You do need a distraction. Maggie has really taken a lot of the heat in this difficult situation. Stephen was working and Camel seemed depressed about what had happened and withdrawn. Maggie needed a breather and a reset of energy. After getting on an airplane to Los Angeles, she checked into a hotel. The meeting with the former classmate she had told her housemates about was just a legend. In reality, Maggie's goal was to get to an Emin Claridge's concert and try to make her way to him. Walking along the promenade and enjoying the fresh air, Maggie pondered how to get to Emin. It won't work, then I'll have to look for him in another city and try again, she thought. But the doctors warned that the longer Vivian was in a coma, the less chance she had. Time was working against the girl and all of them. Maggie wanted to ask Emin to help with the money and getting Vivian to one of the best clinics in New York. They have the resources there to put such heavy patients back on their feet. And in their town, Vivian had virtually no chance. She would slowly fade away in a coma. Maggie couldn't let that happen. How would Camel live with that kind of guilt afterward? While Vivian was in the hospital, Maggie rethought the situation. She recalled various episodes and realized more and more clearly that Vivian was a kind, good girl. There was no better daughter-in-law for her well-to-do son. Now Maggie could not understand her own previous behavior. Why had she been so set against Vivian? Why did she want to see the daughter of wealthy parents by Camel's side? Foolishness, a relic of the past. Now Maggie had only warm feelings for Vivian, affection, tenderness, sympathy. And of course Maggie was very anxious about Vivian's future. No matter what happened, they would certainly not abandon her, just so long as Vivian came to her senses. And that evening there was a concert at the local concert hall. It seems that this Claridge's is really quite popular. There were several doors open at once to let the audience in, and a long line lined up at each one, with McCullough at the tail end of one of them. The crowd varied from young teenagers, almost children, to people of advanced age. So Maggie didn't stand out. Some were laughing, some were singing songs from the Claridge repertoire. Apparently carefree people who came to enjoy the performance of their favorite performer and spend a pleasant evening. Maggie, on the other hand, was here on a mission. The woman, standing in line, looked at numerous posters of Claridge. He was a handsome man, but older, about 10 to 15 years older than Camel and Vivian. Nice looking, And he had good eyes, like he cared. I just wish he'd help me, if only he'd help me. You never know. Maybe Vivian and her cousin really sincerely believe in his unearthly love and sincere feelings. And in fact, he has a carload of people like Vivian. Creative people, they are so in love, emotional, quickly flare up, quickly and cool down. They forget. And McCullough sighed. She had so much hope for this man. They simply had no one else to turn to. The concert itself lasted about 2 hours. Claridge gave it his best. There was a frenzied energy from him that the people in the audience could feel. They were shouting his name, singing along, dancing. Maggie didn't notice how she was infected by the general mood. Strangely, she liked Claridge's songs. She wasn't much of a fan of modern artists, prejudiced against them. And for good reason. Claridge's songs had everything meaning, memorable melodies, striking energy and rhythm. Many of the songs seemed vaguely familiar. Well, of course, Lily had said Claridge sounded from every iron. Surely Maggie had heard him before. During her break, she went to the nearest flower store and bought a bouquet there for a lot of money. Of course, the woman had put a note in it just in case. Ideally, she wanted to be able to tell Claridge herself, but she didn't know how it would work out. In the note, she outlined the situation with Vivian in a nutshell with no details. It simply said that the girl was in trouble and asked Claridge to come to the back door of the concert hall at a certain time. She would be waiting for him there. The second half of the concert was just as energy-filled as the first. The crowd cheered to see their idol. Maggie involuntarily adopted this general mood. Claridge now seemed almost omnipotent. He would surely help Vivian. And now, at last, the moment was right. The last song was played, and people rushed to the stage. Many people carried flowers for the singer. Some just rushed to shake his hand. Claridge was in no hurry to leave. He seemed to want to talk to the audience, too. Several guys from the audience, noticing an elderly woman, made their way to the stage and helped her. Some pushed people, others gently led Maggie behind them. And there she is standing at the stage with her bouquet, and Claridge looks at her and smiles warmly. This is the moment of truth. It couldn't have come at a better time. Vivian's in trouble. Maggie shouted loudly. The Vivian who was a waitress at the bar. Is that where you met her? The smile slowly slipped from Claridge's face, and anxiety appeared in his eyes. The older woman was cheering. He remembered the girl named Vivian. It seemed to really still mean something to him. Maggie was perfectly able to read emotions, and saw that her words made a strong impression on the man. Wait here, Claridge asked. Then he ran up to one of the guys on the stage, dressed in a black shirt and black pants. Apparently it was his assistant. Claridge said something to him. He nodded. Maggie had already been pushed off the stage. From the situation described, Claridge continued to interact with the fans, but his face was no longer as carefree and happy as it had been after hearing Maggie's disturbing news about Vivian. A couple minutes later, Maggie is approached by the same guy from the stage. Hi, Claridge wants you to wait for him in the dressing room. Come with me. The dressing room was a huge room with lots of mirrors and couches. There were bags everywhere, clothes lying around. Maggie cautiously sat down in a chair. Wait here. The attendant smiled politely. Claridge will finish on the stage and come back here. I have to go. Maggie spent about 40 minutes alone. The crowd still wouldn't let go of their idol. And then Claridge came in tired in a soaked t-shirt. Alarmed, he immediately grabbed a bottle of water from the table and emptied it almost in one go. Then he sat down across from Maggie and looked her straight in the eye. Let's get right to the point. What happened to Vivian? That's a really important person to me. And Maggie told. It was hard to confess things to this man, such as her initial attitude toward Vivian, her husband's terrible act. Claridge listened attentively, didn't interrupt, just listened and nodded his head from time to time. Next to this strong man, Maggie, to her own surprise, felt calm. Now that he knew everything, everything would be all right. She'd done the most important thing she'd gotten through to Claridge. He would surely think of something. Beautiful, correct facial features, confident look, charisma, money, talent. Vivian was right to fall in love with such a man. Even her own husband, a young girl, could prefer a man like Claridge. Yes, if Maggie had been younger, she would have fallen in love with him herself. Surprisingly, this fact proved once again that Vivian was indeed very fond of her husband. Maggie did not suspect her of greed. Poor girl, Claridge said when Maggie had finished. Who would have thought she would have such a fate? Your son. I'm sorry, of course, but what he did was extremely irresponsible, to put it mildly. I didn't like him right away. I didn't know what Vivian saw in him, but she loved him with all her heart. Maybe even felt sorry for him. She has a very kind heart. So will you help her? Maggie McCullough asked. She wasn't going to defend her son or change Emmeen's mind. Her goal was something else entirely. Of course, I don't have that kind of money readily available right now, but I'll do a benefit concert in LA and get some friends to do the same. In 3 days, we'll have the money, and I'll organize the whole thing. Transporting Vivian, getting her into the clinic, finding the best doctors for her. We'll get her out, Emmon replied. You are a wonderful man. Tears came to Maggie McCullough's eyes. She cried with relief and joy. Had she really succeeded? Would this powerful and strong man really save Vivian? Do you know our story? Emmon suddenly asked. A slight smile touched his lips, which immediately brightened his manly face. In general terms, Maggie McCullough smiled back. But I'd like to know more. I wasn't so famous then, but I was already performing. I was already making money, already had an audience. I used to go to the Rock Bar a lot, and I had a lot of friends there. Before that, I liked the place itself. It was an amazing place. But now, unfortunately, it's not like that anymore. I immediately noticed the pretty waitress with wide open eyes. She was special. She had this amazing energy about her. Vivian always smiled at the customers, no matter how tired she was. The girl could calm a cranky client with one look or word and make him smile. Caring, gentle, alert, and beautiful, of course. I once realized that I purposely began to adjust my visits to the Rock Bar to get into the shift of this waitress. She had a strong effect on me. A man wanted to see her eyes, hear the girl's voice. Sometimes they exchanged jokes, sometimes laughed together, but Emmon did not dare to openly express his sympathy. It seemed to him that it might disturb the lightness of their budding relationship. Emmon, under the impression of the young, beautiful waitress, even wrote a few songs that quickly became hits. He was attracted to her and inspired by her. But the difference in age, the difference in social status, all this kept Emmon from recognizing her. What if Vivian was afraid? If this girl showed her sympathy in any way, a special sympathy, not her usual friendliness, Emmon would be the happiest man in the world. He would immediately confess his feelings to Vivian. He would have been able to make her life bright, carefree, pleasant. But no, Vivian clearly didn't see him as a potential mate. And then Emmon had a rival, which prompted him to take more decisive steps. It was Camel, a student. He used to show up at the bar a lot, all unkempt, with a vague look in his eyes. The guy would try to get drunk as soon as possible. Then this senseless body was dragged by a cab by one of his friends. Eamon understood perfectly well he does not get drunk just like that almost every day. The young man's life has clearly had some trouble. Nothing. The young will come to his senses, calm down. Who doesn't happen at that age? Or maybe his behavior will get him into trouble. That's just the way it is. But Vivian, beautiful Vivian, for some reason could not remain indifferent to the misfortune of this camel. Eamon watched with envy as she sat beside the boy, stroked his shoulders, said something soothing. Camel at first didn't seem to take Vivian or her support at all. But then he began to smile, to answer her something. Their conversations went on for hours. What they talked about, Emmon didn't know, but of course perfectly understood what was going on. Between the young people, clearly budding relationship. And Eamon did not like it. He had already realized that he had the strongest feelings for Vivian that he had ever felt. She special Eamon shook his head, looking at Maggie McCullough. I still think so. There's no one else like her. She just nodded. It was a pity the woman herself realized it too late. Her sister-in-law was truly a miracle. Sincere, warm, kind. Kamel gradually, under Vivian's influence and support, came to his senses. It was no longer a lost, permanently inebriated guy, but a very even handsome young man, witty, funny, lively. He and Vivian started dating, and only then Eamon decided to act openly. There was no time to think about it. so he simply asked Vivian to sit down at his table one day. This had already happened, and more than once. The girl often sat down with some of the regulars, then to others to chat, laugh. She liked socializing. I told her all about me, and shook his head. Right there. What is interesting, I write songs, including about love. I never complained about my lack of eloquence. But here, I couldn't string two words together, stammering, trying to formulate phrases correctly. And she sat there seriously, looking at me and not saying a word. She let me speak, didn't interrupt me. It was an amazing moment. I wrote a hit song afterwards. I even played it today. People always love it. It touches people, I guess. Vivian listened to mine, smiled sadly at him, and said what the man knew already. She loves Camel, and Camel loves her. Without her, he will fall again, flying at breakneck speed into the abyss. Turns out Camel had been through an unhappy love affair. Some adult married woman had captured his heart and mind. They met, started dating. Young, handsome guy was a way for this lady to get away from the gray of everyday life. A fleeting diversion. But Camel fell in love for real. His mistress, which is quite natural, left the young admirer when she was bored with their romance, found a new friend, and Camel here sought her. When Camel realized that it was useless, he realized that this woman never had serious feelings for him. He started drinking heavily, almost got kicked out of university, didn't socialize with anyone. Vivian saved him back then. If it wasn't for her, that Camel wouldn't have stopped. He didn't have a chance. She got him out and him. He practically sent her to the afterlife. Maggie McCullough thought for a moment. Yes, indeed, she had sensed something was happening to her son when he lived alone in Los Angeles. But on the phone, Camel had reported in a casual tone that everything was fine and then immediately dropped the call. And that's what really happened. Personal drama. Vivian pulled him out, brought him back to life. McCullough should have been praying to her as a mother. Except they didn't tell her anything, the young ones. Camel probably didn't want to. And Vivian didn't seem to want to make a big deal out of what she'd done. When Maggie McCullough learned the truth, she felt even more for her sister-in-law. Wow, she rejected a man like a chicken. And for Camel's sake, she got the lad out of trouble and left the capital with him. Before Camel, she was lucky. Lucky as it is rare for anyone in the world to be lucky. The woman thought. She understood her son's condition better now. Vivian had saved him, and he had put her in such danger and put her in a coma. The weight of guilt now weighing on Camel's shoulders must be enormous. It's a warm September day. A couple of elderly couples and a young man and woman are walking along the promenade. Camel gently supports Vivian by the elbow. She is still very thin, but her eyes look meaningful and eager for life again. They are in Miami. The girl had never walked along this wonderful promenade before and was now enjoying the views. Vivian had finally gotten strong enough to be allowed to travel, only not far away and without a change of climate. She was bored with the hospital walls she had spent so much time in. Vivian wanted a change of scenery so much that her family arranged the trip for her. Maggie McCullough had chosen a place not far from their home. The waterfront had delighted her, and Camel on their last visit to this town. Even Stephen, leaving all his business behind, went with them. Emin kept his promise and organized several charity concerts. His musician friends helped him, and many of them did the same. Maggie was very grateful to these people. It always seemed to her that people like them, these celebrities, whom we see only on TV screens, are capricious, selfish. They do not care about other people's misfortune. But it turned out quite differently. It turns out that these are kind and sensitive men and women. The necessary amount was collected in record time. Emin, among other things, took on himself all the cares for the transportation of Vivian and her placement in the right clinic. It was not easy, because there was always a huge queue for doctors dealing with such cases. People from all over the country sought this center, despite the exorbitant rates. Experimental methods were practiced here. The project was not supported from the budget, at least not yet, but the results were inspiring. Seeing Vivian in the hospital bed, the sturdy grown man almost cried. He looked at her with such tenderness, stroked her hands so gently. Maggie McCullough's heart was breaking at the sight of this scene. Emin still has some feelings for Vivian. He has a spouse, 2 children, but something else is clearly left. Maggie and Camel settled near the medical center where Vivian was now being treated. Stephen went home. He had to work, but mother and son stayed close by and visited the patient every day. The day Vivian came to her senses was a day that Maggie McCullough would always remember. On the morrow, nothing heralded such joy. Maggie and Camel were going to the hospital as usual. And then the call came. They were asked to come quickly, for Vivian had opened her eyes and was trying to speak. The girl immediately recognized them as soon as they burst into the room. Her eyes reflected first relief that her loved ones were near, and then joy. The doctors had made no guarantees, had warned that Vivian might be different, and had even said that she probably would be. But in front of the astonished Maggie McCullough and Camel was she, the very same Vivian. There could be no doubt. Vivian was not going anywhere. Everything would be all right now. Ammon had also visited Vivian in the hospital after she woke up. Maggie didn't know what they talked about. It was none of her business. But the woman was open to the possibility that the girl would go to Ammon or just leave. After what Camel had done, she had a right to resent him. Vivian almost died because of her husband's carelessness. Well, would Maggie McCullough have accepted such a decision from her daughter-in-law? But Vivian never separated from her husband. She loved Camel no matter what, and held no grudge or anger against him. It was my fault too. Vivian shook her head. I saw him drinking and sat down with him. I didn't talk him out of it. I didn't even try to talk him out of doing something dangerous. Did you want to get home so badly? I figured it'd be okay. I mean, we could have both died. Fools. The recovery was long and difficult. Maggie McCullough, Camel, even the ever-busy Stephen were all there for Vivian, helping her, supporting her. Sometimes we had to force her to do exercises through pain and tears, and then calm her down. But the result was impressive. Vivian first sat up, then stood up, then started walking. And now she is almost the same as before, only very weak and cannot gain weight. But the doctors say she'll get there. They were generally very complimentary of the patient and her support group. Camel has changed a lot because of this situation. He has become more mature, responsible, and serious. He now practically never leaves Vivian's side, warns her every wish, protects her. Youthful adventurism, carelessness, disregard for rules and frameworks, all this is in the past. It was all gone. Maggie McCullough was glad to see it. The accident that could have ruined the lives of so many people was a serious lesson for everyone. Maggie had learned a lot about her sister-in-law, and now saw her through very different eyes. The woman in general has changed a lot, became more attentive and tolerant to people, learned to notice other people's troubles and sorrows, and got involved in old age rock. Now Maggie McCullough was a loyal fan of Ammon. His songs, it turned out, were so deep, they had so much meaning. One of Ammon's compositions was exactly what was playing in her headphones right now at this moment. Maggie smiled.